Abraham's story begins in the mists of the Bronze Age, in a world of idol-filled cities and nomadic trails. Nearly 4 millennia ago, one man's journey altered the course of history. This is the story of Abraham, a Mesopotamian traveller turned patriarch, whose life of faith would reverberate through Jewish, Christian and Muslim traditions. In this explainer, we follow Abraham's footsteps across ancient lands, uncovering the historical geography, cultural contexts and theological insights that make his journey so extraordinary. From the bustling streets of Ur to the oak groves of Canaan, from moments of doubt to acts of profound faith, Abraham's life is a rich tapestry of drama and promise. Let's step back in time and retrace this epic journey, connecting the dots between historical evidence and the biblical narrative, and discover how Abraham became a founding father to billions. Please like, comment and subscribe at the end to support more explorations like this. Ruins of ancient Ur in modern Iraq traditionally identified as Abraham's birthplace. In the early 2nd millennium BCE, Abraham, then called Abram, was born in Ur of the Chaldeans, a thriving Sumerian city-state in southern Mesopotamia. Ur sat near the Euphrates River, in today's Iraq, and was a centre of wealth and culture. Archaeologists excavating Ur uncovered grand ziggurats and royal tombs, revealing a highly advanced urban society. Life in Ur revolved around polytheistic worship. The city's patron deity was Nana Sin, the moon god, whose massive temple dominated the skyline. This means Abram grew up amid an atmosphere of elaborate rituals and idols. His father, Terah, likely participated in this idol worship. In fact, the Hebrew name Terah is related to the word for moon, hinting at devotion to lunar deities. Despite Ur's splendour, the biblical account hints at future change. Genesis identifies Ur as Abram's birthplace and the starting point of his family's migration. It was here that Abram's brother Haran died, an event that may have shaken their household. The bustling city, with its crowded streets and towering ziggurat, was Abraham's childhood home, a place of comfort and civilization. Yet, amid Ur's many gods and secure walls, Abram's destiny lay elsewhere. According to later tradition, Abram might have begun questioning the idolatries around him, sensing a call from a higher unseen god. In a world where people worshipped the moon and stars, Abram's heart was being prepared for a revolutionary journey of faith. Little did he know that he would soon leave this prosperous metropolis for an uncertain path, one that would forever change his identity and the spiritual landscape of the world. Abram's family lineage set the stage for his unique calling. He was the son of Terah, a descendant of Noah's son Shem, according to Genesis. Terah had 3 sons, Abram, Nahor and Haran, and they lived as part of the extended family in Ur. Importantly, the Bible suggests that Abram's family, though originally from Mesopotamia, was not immune to the era's idol worship. Much later, Joshua 24:2 recalls, "Long ago your fathers lived beyond the Euphrates, Terah, the father of Abraham and Nahor, and they served other gods." This implies Abram was raised in a context of polytheism. His relatives likely prayed to carved deities and celestial gods common in Mesopotamia. Yet within this ordinary family something extraordinary was unfolding. We're told that Abram married Sarai, his half-sister, Terah's daughter, by another wife, according to Genesis 20:12, whose name means princess. Sarai was barren, a poignant detail in a culture where offspring were everything. The couple's childlessness must have been a source of private pain and social stigma, especially given Abram's own name meaning exalted father. The irony was sharp. Here was Father Abram with no children to call his own. Still, Abram cared for his nephew Lot, Haran's son, perhaps as an adopted heir. As family patriarch Terah aged, he made a momentous decision. The whole household would leave Ur. The book of Genesis doesn't explain why, maybe economic opportunity, famine, political unrest, or grief over Haran's death. But Abram's family packed their belongings, loaded their camels, and left behind Ur's towering ziggurat and fertile plains. Unbeknownst to them, this move was the first step on a divine itinerary. Abram's ordinary family, rooted in moon god worship and marked by barrenness, was about to be set apart for an extraordinary purpose by an extraordinary God. The family's journey from Ur led them northwest along the Fertile Crescent to Haran, also spelled Haran, a caravan city in Upper Mesopotamia. Haran lay about 600 miles from Ur, in what is now southeast Turkey, and in ancient times it thrived at a crossroads of trade routes. This move was significant. Terah's household had left the prosperous cradle of Sumer for a foreign land. Yet Haran would have felt familiar in one way. It was also a major centre for worship of the moon god Sin. In fact, excavations in Haran have uncovered a large mud brick building from around 2000 BCE, believed to be a temple of Sin. The same idolatrous culture of persisted here. Terah, who led the migration, may have continued his moon god devotions in Haran's shrines. Scriptures later comment about Terah's family serving other gods beyond the river, the Euphrates, likely points to this period. Haran, with its bustling bazaars and distinctive beehive-shaped houses, offered a new home but not yet a new spiritual direction. The family settled in Haran, and time passed. Terah's journey stalled here. Perhaps the old man found comfort in this thriving city so similar to the one they left. It was in Haran that Terah's life came to an end at 205 years old, by the ages given in Genesis. His death marked the end of an era for the family. For Abram, now about 75, Haran was a place of both continuity and transition. He had gained wealth and flocks, and maintained his household with Sarai and Lot. Haran's name, notably, was the same as Abram's deceased brother, a poignant echo. In Jewish tradition, some even thought Abram might have been born in Haran and only later moved to Ur, though Genesis presents the reverse. Either way, Haran became a proving ground. Abram had uprooted once. Would he uproot again? He had followed his father here, but now a greater call was about to beckon him onward. In the flourishing city of Haran, Abram faced a choice between settling into comfortable obscurity or heeding a radical new summons that would change his life forever. Haran is where Abram encountered the defining moment of his life. According to Genesis 12:1, God spoke to Abram, issuing a stunning command: "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you." This was a call to leave everything familiar, his land, his people, his security, and venture into the unknown on faith. God's message didn't stop at a command. It came with an audacious promise. God promised to make Abram into a great nation, to bless him and make his name great, and through him to bless all the families of the earth. In essence, Abram was invited into a covenant relationship with a single deity who demanded exclusive loyalty, a stark contrast to the many gods of Mesopotamia. This moment marks the birth of biblical monotheism in Abram's story. Abram believed and obeyed. Without recorded hesitation, he prepared to depart Haran in pursuit of the land God would show him. It's hard to overstate the courage this required. Abram had no map or destination, only a promise. He likely shared this divine encounter with Sarai and Lot. One imagines late-night conversations under Haran's starry sky, pondering where the unknown God might lead them. In answering this call, Abram effectively cut ties with the life he'd known. He would be leaving behind extended family, the comfort of Haran's community, and the continuity of Terah's household. Theologically, this call was a pivot point, the start of a covenant story that runs through the Bible. Judaism regards this as the moment Abraham became the founding father of their faith, stepping into a covenant that his descendants would inherit. From a historical angle, such migrations weren't unheard of. Nomadic groups often moved in search of grazing or at divine behest in ancient tales. But Abram's claim that God personally directed him set his journey apart. With Terah gone and the divine command in his ears, Abram embraced a new identity, a pilgrim of promise. At 75 years old, he loaded his tents onto pack animals, gathered his flocks and servants, and with Sarai and Lot set out southward. The caravan left Haran's gates heading toward Canaan, leaving behind the last remnants of their old life. It was a leap of faith of monumental proportions, an act of trust in a promise that would shape the future of nations. When Abram departed Haran, it was a decisive break with his past. He went forth as the Lord had spoken to him, Genesis 12:4, embarking on a journey of roughly 400 to 500 miles to the southwest. Abram took Sarai, his wife, Lot, his orphaned nephew, and all their possessions and people acquired in Haran. The caravan winding out of Haran would have been an impressive sight. Flocks of sheep and goats, donkeys carrying tents and supplies, servants guiding livestock, and Abram leading the way on foot or camel. In obeying God's call, Abram became a migrant once more, but this time with a divine purpose. The route likely followed the Fertile Crescent's well-trodden paths skirting the Syrian desert. They would have travelled through ancient towns like Damascus or Aleppo, then turned south toward Canaan. The Bible notes Abram's age, 75, underscoring that this was no youthful adventure but a mature commitment. His willingness to uproot his large household testifies to his faith and leadership. As they left Haran's familiar surroundings, one can imagine Abram reassuring his family with the promise God gave, that this journey would birth a great nation. Every step forward was an act of trust that somewhere ahead lay the land that God would show him. Canaan at the time was a patchwork of small city-states and tribes inhabiting the land bridge between Mesopotamia and Egypt. Arriving there meant entering a foreign world with different peoples and languages. The biblical text says, "They set out for the land of Canaan and they arrived there," Genesis. 12 மணி 5 நிமிடம். This understated line belies the significance of what had occurred. Abram had effectively passed from the old civilization into a new frontier. When he crossed the final river or hill that marked Canaan's border, he was stepping into the unknown both geographically and spiritually. In leaving home, Abram became a stranger in a strange land, a pioneer of faith. This leg of the journey might have taken weeks or months. They likely followed water sources and pasture lands, making stops to feed the animals. At night, the family camped under open skies. For Sarai and Lot, and the many servants, this voyage demanded extraordinary adaptability and trust in Abram's vision. Every day increased the distance from Haran's comforts, yet Abram pressed on, fueled by the unseen hand of providence guiding him southward. The caravan's arrival in Canaan set the stage for the next chapter of Abram's life, one that would bring both trials and profound encounters with the divine. Abram eventually entered Canaan, the land promised to him by God. Canaan was a strategically located region between Syria and Egypt, essentially the territory of modern Israel, Palestine. It was a land of hills and plains, inhabited by various Canaanite tribes living in fortified cities like Shechem, Bethel, and Hebron. Upon arrival, Abram did not settle in a city. Instead, he continued living a semi-nomadic life, dwelling in tents. His first recorded stop was at Shechem, a verdant area between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. At the Oak of Moreh in Shechem, Abram received a remarkable confirmation of his journey's purpose. God appeared to him and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." Genesis 12:7. This promise must have been awe-inspiring. Imagine Abram standing in a foreign valley, surrounded by Canaanite altars and sacred trees, hearing that all of it would one day belong to his descendants. Yet at that moment, the land was occupied by others. The Canaanites were there, then in the land, as Genesis notes, emphasizing that Abram was a newcomer among established local peoples. In response to God's promise, Abram built his first altar in Canaan at Shechem, formally dedicating the place to the Lord. This was a bold act. An altar to Abram's God in the very heart of Canaanite territory signified that a new chapter was beginning. Moving on, Abram pitched his tent in the hill country between Bethel and Ai. There he built a second altar and called upon the name of the Lord, Genesis 12:8, openly worshipping the one God. These altars were simple piles of stones, yet symbolically they marked Abraham's spiritual claim on the land. They were like planting flags of faith across Canaan. For Abram's household, life in Canaan meant adapting to a migratory existence, grazing flocks on the hills by day, gathering round campfires by night. Abram likely interacted with local Canaanites through trading or negotiating grazing rights. To them, he would have appeared as a wealthy tent dweller with a large retinue, perhaps just another transient herdsman. But Abram carried in his heart the extraordinary promise that this whole country was destined for his offspring. Though he owned not a single acre yet, he journeyed through Canaan's length and breadth, perhaps to survey the land that would one day belong to his seed. His arrival in Canaan was not the end of his travels, but the beginning of a lifelong sojourn in the land of promise. In Canaan, Abram lived as a sojourner, moving his encampment from place to place. Everywhere he went, he left evidence of his faith. Altars dedicated to the Lord. These were more than ritual sites. They were physical tokens of the covenant between Abram and God, and early symbols of monotheistic worship in a pagan land. The altar at Shechem marked God's first explicit promise of land to Abram's descendants. Later, when Abram moved to the hills near Bethel, He built another altar and called on God's name openly. Such public worship was a stark departure from the local norms. The Canaanites worshipped a pantheon of gods, El, Baal, Asherah, etc., with elaborate temples and idols, whereas Abram offered sacrifices to an unseen god with no image. This would have seemed peculiar to his neighbours. Yet Abram's altars likely drew curiosity and perhaps respect. Here was a chieftain invoking a deity who, in Abram's experience, actually spoke and made covenants. Each altar, in effect, was Abram staking a claim not in political terms but in spiritual ones, trusting that God's promise, "I will give this land to your offspring," was as solid as any deed. These early days in Canaan were marked by promise but not possession. Abram and Sarai remained childless, and they owned no land except the grass their animals grazed. Nonetheless, God's word sustained them. At Bethel, looking out over the hill country, Abram could reflect on the breadth of the land promised to him, from the rugged mountains to the coastal plains. He journeyed on southward, into the Negev, a semi-arid region. Throughout his travels, the presence of God seemed to accompany Abram, guiding him. The Bible doesn't record daily details, but we can imagine Abram praying at his altars for guidance and protection. He was learning to rely on God in a way that set him apart from his contemporaries. Each altar was also an act of gratitude. Despite having no children or territory yet, Abram thanked God in advance. This is a powerful picture of faith, building altars of praise for promises not yet fulfilled. In Canaan's unfolding chapters, those promises would face significant tests. But for now, Abram's altars stood silently under the Canaanite sun, witnesses to a covenant unseen by others yet utterly real to him. As newcomers in Canaan, Abram and his household lived among foreign tribes, striving to maintain peace and sustain themselves. The biblical narrative emphasizes that the Canaanites were in the land, Genesis 12:6, highlighting that Abram was a resident alien. Practically, this meant adapting to local customs while holding to his distinct identity. Abram's clan likely pitched tents on the outskirts of settled areas, avoiding conflict by not encroaching on cultivated fields. They led a pastoral life, grazing sheep and goats on the open range, moving seasonally to find water and grass. This nomadic lifestyle set them apart from the city-dwelling Canaanites, but it also allowed mobility. Abram could relocate when needed, a flexibility that would prove crucial in times of trouble. Culturally, Abram had to navigate relationships with the local peoples. We aren't told of specific encounters at first, but given his wealth, Abram would have been noticed. He possibly negotiated grazing rights or wells with local chiefs. We know he was regarded as a man of standing, even if a foreigner, because later some Canaanites call him a mighty prince among us. Genesis 23:6. His reputation for integrity and piety likely grew. At his altars, local residents might have observed this stranger worshipping a single invisible god, a curiosity in a land of many idols. Yet Abram did not try to impose his ways on others. He was content to live peaceably. When disputes arose, as with his nephew Lot later, Abram showed himself to be a peacemaker. This ability to coexist without assimilating entirely was key. He remained distinct in worship and promise, yet cordial in everyday dealings. Abram's stranger status also had a spiritual dimension. Hebrews 11:9 later reflects that by faith Abram sojourned in the land of promise, as in a foreign country, living in tents. This captures the paradox of Abram's life. He was in the land God pledged to him, yet he dwelled in it as a transient, trusting that the fulfillment lay in the future. Through this, Abram embodied the life of a pilgrim, in the world but looking beyond it. His experience as a stranger in Canaan foreshadowed the experience of his descendants, who would also live among other nations with a calling to be set apart. For now, Abram's days were filled with the humble routines of herding and family life, all while clinging to the extraordinary promises of God each night, as he gazed at the starry skies over Canaan. After some time in Canaan, Abram faced his first major test. A severe famine struck the land, Genesis 12:10 rainfall in Canaan could be unpredictable, and droughts were not uncommon in antiquity. This famine was serious enough to make staying put impossible. The grass withered, waterholes dried up, and Abram's flocks and herds were in jeopardy. Imagine Abram's dilemma. He had followed God to this promised land, only to find it seemingly unable to sustain him. It must have raised difficult questions. Where was the blessing in a land that couldn't feed his family? Was this a punishment or simply a trial of faith? In such crises, ancient peoples often migrated to survive, and Abram was no exception. Abram decided to go down to Egypt, a natural refuge in times of Canaanite famine. The Nile's irrigation made Egypt the breadbasket of the region, often able to supply grain when rain-fed lands like Canaan went barren. This decision shows Abram using practical wisdom. However, the biblical narrative leaves open whether Abram sought God's direction in this move or acted on his own. Regardless, the famine forced Abram to become a refugee in search of food, a humbling experience after the assurances of prosperity. The journey from Canaan to Egypt would have been arduous but relatively direct, heading southwest toward the Nile Delta. This marked Abram's first encounter with the great civilization of Egypt. Around the early 2nd millennium BCE, the time many place Abraham's life, Egypt was a powerful kingdom, rich in agriculture and culture. For Abram's entourage, entering Egypt meant crossing a cultural frontier. They left the sparsely populated highlands of Canaan for the densely settled valley of the Nile, with its towering monuments and sophisticated society. The famine serves as an interesting narrative pivot. It tested Abram's faith in God's promise. Is this really the land of blessing if we have to leave it to survive? And set the stage for a new kind of challenge. Often in life, a calling gets tested by adversity. Here, the promised land itself was inhospitable, pushing Abram to seek relief elsewhere. Theologically, it's a subtle reminder that being in God's will doesn't exempt one from hardship. In fact, hardships can serve a purpose in the larger story. The famine drove Abram into a situation that would expose his fears and God's faithfulness in a new way. This trial by hunger was about to lead Abram into one of the most tense episodes of his journey, revealing both his fallibility and God's protective grace. Fleeing famine, Abram entered Egypt as a sojourner. This was likely during Egypt's Middle Kingdom period, a time of relative stability and prosperity for the pharaohs. As Abram approached the Egyptian border, he became acutely aware of a potential danger. His wife Sarai, though around 65 years old, was strikingly beautiful. The long lifespans of that era's accounts suggest she appeared in middle age. Abram feared that Egyptian officials or the pharaoh himself might desire Sarai and kill Abram to have her. Such fears weren't unfounded in ancient courts, where rulers exercised absolute power and harems included foreign women of renowned beauty. So Abram resorted to a half-truth. He instructed Sarai to say she was his sister, not his wife. Indeed, Sarai was Abram's half-sister, Terah's daughter from another wife. But the intent here was deceitful. Abram hoped this ruse would protect his life, if powerful men thought Sarai unattached. Abram, as her brother, might be treated well, not eliminated. This plan reveals Abram's humanity and fear. Despite his faith, he struggled with anxiety over personal safety. Rather than fully trusting God to safeguard them in Egypt, he took matters into his own hands. Upon entering Egypt, things played out as Abram feared, and more. The Egyptians did notice Sarai's beauty. She was taken into the pharaoh's palace, likely to join the royal harem, Genesis 12:15. This was a critical moment. Abram's lie appeared to backfire spectacularly. While Abram himself was treated well for Sarai's sake, Pharaoh gave him sheep, cattle, donkeys, servants, and camels as bride price gifts. He had effectively jeopardized the purity of the promised mother of his heir. Sarai was now in a royal household, and Abram had little control. Imagine Abram's turmoil, enriched with Egyptian wealth, yet inwardly guilt-ridden and fearful for his wife. His actions had put the covenant promise at risk, since Sarai was integral to God's plan for a promised child. The Bible is terse about Abram's feelings, but one can sense the tension. Abram, the man of faith, had stumbled into deceit, and now Sarai's fate hung precariously. Culturally, his behaviour might reflect the norms of patriarchal survival. It was not uncommon for men to claim female relatives to gain favour or avoid conflict. But morally, the narrative cast a critical eye. Abram, the chosen one, had lied and endangered his own wife. The stage was set for divine intervention to untangle this mess. Abram's sojourn in Egypt thus became a lesson that even a patriarch's faith could falter, and that God's faithfulness would have to compensate for human failure. Inside Pharaoh's opulent palace, Sarai suddenly found herself living a very different life. Gone were the tents under Canaan's stars. Now she resided among Egypt's elite, surrounded by ornate columns, servants, and perhaps other women of the royal harem. We can only imagine her anxiety and loneliness. She had agreed to Abram's sister deception, but now it had led to this frightening scenario. Yet notably, the biblical account does not ascribe blame to Sarai. It focuses on Abram's lapse and God's response. While Sarai was in Pharaoh's household, Abram remained outside, powerless, and likely racked with guilt. Ironically, Abram prospered materially during this time. Pharaoh lavished him with livestock and servants, effectively paying a bride price, thinking he was enriching Sarai's brother. Abram's wealth grew even as he'd compromised his integrity. It's a classic moral irony, worldly gain achieved through wrongdoing. But Abraham's story is ultimately about God's grace, not human perfection, and grace was about to intervene dramatically on Sarai's behalf. God struck Pharaoh's house with plagues, sudden afflictions that signaled divine disapproval, Genesis 12:17. The nature of these plagues isn't detailed, but they were severe enough to grab Pharaoh's attention and somehow reveal the truth that Sarai was Abram's wife. Perhaps illness befell Pharaoh or his household, and in seeking the cause, the matter of Sarai's marital status came to light. An ancient mindset would interpret unexplained plagues as a curse from a god, and here it became clear that taking Sarai was the offence. Pharaoh confronted Abram with understandable anger. "What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me she was your wife?" General 12:18. Abram had no good answer. His deception was exposed, his fear-driven plan a fiasco. Pharaoh, who ironically shows more uprightness in this episode than Abram, promptly returned Sarai to her husband. He then ordered Abram and his entire entourage to leave Egypt. Remarkably, Pharaoh did not confiscate the gifts he'd given. Abram left with all the wealth acquired, essentially by Pharaoh's grace, and ultimately God's providence. This expulsion was humiliating yet merciful. Abram had escaped a dangerous predicament due to God's intervention, not his own cleverness. The plagues that fell on Pharaoh's house underscored that God was protecting Sarai's honour and the integrity of the promise, even when Abram's actions had jeopardized it. As Abram and Sarai exited Egypt, likely escorted to the border by Pharaoh's men, they carried with them both great possessions and important lessons. They learned that God was able to deliver them from their own mistakes, and that dishonesty born of fear could have costly consequences. This Egyptian detour, though fraught with peril, ultimately strengthened their reliance on God's faithfulness as they returned to Canaan. The crisis in Egypt reached its turning point through divine intervention. The great plagues that struck Pharaoh's household were not mere coincidences. They were targeted troubles that Pharaoh correctly linked to Sarai's presence. Perhaps the women of his palace were struck barren or some mysterious illness spread because of Sarai, Abram's wife. In these afflictions, we see a foreshadow of what would happen generations later in Moses' time, when plagues again would force a pharaoh to let God's people go. For Abram's story, the plagues served a clear purpose: to protect Sarai's chastity and return her to Abram untouched. Pharaoh, realizing he was in divine crosshairs, wasted no time in remedying the situation. He summoned Abram and, in what must have been a tense encounter, rebuked him. Pharaoh's words, paraphrased, were, "Why did you say she's your sister, so that I took her to be my wife? Here is your wife back. Take her and go." The tone of this rebuke highlights that even a pagan king understood the moral breach that Abram's lie had caused. Abram remained silent in the biblical account. There was little he could say. He had gambled with the truth and nearly lost what was most precious. Pharaoh's swift expulsion of Abram was actually a form of protection. He provided orders that Abram be escorted out of Egypt with his wife and all his possessions. This ensured that no harm came to Abram's family on the way out, and that none of Pharaoh's subjects would interfere. Thus, Abram left Egypt by the same providence that had sent him there, the hand of God now clearly evident. One might imagine Abram's profound relief as Sarai rejoined him, safe and vindicated. The couple's reunion would have been joyful yet sobering. For Sarai, it was deliverance from a deeply unsettling ordeal. For Abram, it was undeserved mercy. As they travelled back toward Canaan, Abram had time to reflect on God's grace. He had lied out of fear, but God had been faithful to his promise to bless and protect Abram. Interestingly, Abram emerged from Egypt richer than before. He had more livestock, servants, and perhaps importantly, an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar acquired during his sojourn, a detail that will become crucial later. This increase in wealth fulfilled part of God's covenant, blessing Abram, but the means were convoluted by Abram's actions. In the end, the Egypt episode stands as a testament to God's ability to safeguard his plan. It would not be the last time Abram faltered, but it reassured him and the readers that God's promise did not depend on human perfection. Delivered from Egypt's snares, Abram was ready to return to the land of promise, chastened and wiser from the experience. Abram returned to Canaan a humbled man. With Sarai by his side and Lot and the whole caravan in tow, he retraced his steps through the Negev and back into the highlands of Canaan. Genesis 13:3-4 describes Abram's journey to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the altar he had made there at first. This homecoming was likely marked by relief and gratitude. Abram went straight back to Bethel, the last place he had called on God's name before the famine drove him to Egypt. There, upon the altar he'd built, Abram called on the name of the Lord again, likely in repentance and thanksgiving. One can imagine Abram offering sacrifices, the smoke rising heavenward as he rededicated himself to the God who had protected him despite his failings. Bethel symbolized a fresh start, a return to the path of faith after the detour in Egypt. Now back in the Promised Land, Abram had to pick up the threads of normal life. The famine had ended, Canaan was livable again. Abram's flocks and herds had likely grown, both from natural increase and Pharaoh's gifts. The influx of livestock along with new servants, including the Egyptian maid Hagar, meant Abram's camp was larger and more prosperous than ever. This wealth was a sign of God's blessing, yet it would soon present its own challenges. For the moment, Abram's focus was on resettlement. The Negev, the semi-arid southern region of Canaan, had been his route back, but it couldn't sustain his flocks year-round, so Abram moved back into the hill country he loved near Bethel and Ai. Re-establishing grazing patterns, reopening old wells, reconnecting with local allies like Mamre the Amorite near Hebron, mentioned later, all would have been on Abram's agenda. Importantly, his relationship with God was back on track. The text emphasizes worship upon return, suggesting Abram learned from his mistakes. Sometimes one has to go back to the last place of obedience. For Abram, that was Bethel's altar, and start over. With his faith rekindled and family intact, Abram was ready to settle once more in Canaan's hills. But new tensions were on the horizon, testing how he would handle prosperity and family dynamics in this second chapter of life in the Promised Land. As Abram's household resettled in Canaan, success brought strife. Both Abram and his nephew Lot had amassed large flocks, herds, and servants. The land around Bethel that had easily supported them before could no longer sustain the combined abundance of their livestock. Quarrels broke out between Abram's herdsmen and Lot's herdsmen over grazing rights and water wells, Genesis 13:5-7. The friction was not just about grass, it was about growing economic pressures. With so many animals, finding sufficient pasture each day became a competitive endeavour. The herdsmen, loyal to their respective masters, likely argued over who got the best grazing spots or whose sheep drank first at the spring. This kind of dispute was common in the ancient pastoral world and could easily turn violent if unchecked. Moreover, the text notes, the Canaanites and Perizzites were also dwelling in the land, Genesis 13-7, implying that the presence of other local peoples meant available pasture was even more limited. Abram recognized that internal conflict could weaken them and also damage their reputation among their neighbors. As the family elder and Lot's guardian, Abram knew it fell to him to resolve the situation peaceably. Demonstrating maturity and generosity, Abram took the initiative. He approached Lot to make peace, saying, "Let there be no strife between you and me, for we are kinsmen." Genesis. But in Mundra Puliete, Abram's appeal was grounded in family unity, a value he placed above material gain. He proposed a solution that was both humble and magnanimous. They would separate to avoid conflict, and Abram gave Lot the first choice of land. "Is not the whole land before you?" Abram said. "If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right, or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left." Genesis 13:9. This offer is remarkable, considering Abram was the elder and the one with God's promise of the land. He could have pulled rank or insisted on the best share for himself. Instead, He relinquished his rights for the sake of peace. This moment highlights Abram's character growth. Having experienced God's providence, he could afford to be generous. He trusted that God's promise didn't require him to grasp at advantage. Abram's approach diffused what could have been an escalating feud. It set a pattern for conflict resolution through humility and faith. In effect, Abram was saying, "We don't need to fight over blessings. God will take care of my future, no matter what portion I end up with." It was now up to Lot to choose, and that choice would significantly shape both of their futures. Lot accepted Abram's proposal, and the two men prepared to part ways amicably. Standing perhaps on a ridge with a broad view of the surrounding territories, Lot lifted his eyes to survey the land, Genesis. But in Mundramani Pattanimidam to the east lay the Jordan Valley, a dramatic contrast to Canaan's central highlands. Lot saw a well-watered plain, lush and green, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, the text says, before God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. This valley, encompassing the lower Jordan River and the area around the Dead Sea, then a fertile basin, appealed to Lot's desire for prosperity. It promised rich pasture for his herds and the easy life of established cities. Indeed, several cities dotted that plain, notably Sodom and Gomorrah, centres of commerce and culture, albeit with a reputation for wickedness as the narrative foreshadows. On the other hand, to the west and south stretched the rugged hills of Canaan where Abram had been dwelling, land that was more dependent on seasonal rains and harder to farm, though still part of the promised territory. Given the choice, Lot opted for what looked like the obvious path to abundance. He chose the entire Jordan Valley and journeyed east, separating from his uncle Abram, Genesis, Padinmundra Padnundra. This moment was pivotal. It not only physically separated the clan, but it also spiritually distinguished Abram's perspective from Lot's. Lot's decision was driven by sight and immediate benefit. Abram's acquiescence was driven by faith and generosity. Lot moved his tents near the city of Sodom, drawn by the allure of urban life and fertile fields. For Abram, that meant yielding the seemingly superior land without protest. After Lot departed, Abram remained in Canaan's highlands. While Lot's entourage disappeared into the distant Green Valley, Abram might have appeared to an outsider as getting the short end of the deal. Yet, Abram did not second-guess his choice to trust God's provision. Their separation was peaceful, a testament to Abram's leadership. Family ties were preserved without outright conflict, a rare outcome in a time when wealth could easily pit kin against each other. Perhaps they embraced as they parted, with Abram wishing Lot well despite any private misgivings about Lot's direction. Abram returned to his tent and altar, now with quieter pastures and fewer mouths to feed, but also with the loss of his closest kin aside from Sarai. It was a bittersweet moment. Peace was achieved, but at the cost of family distance. Little did they know how significantly Lot's choice would affect his destiny, and how Abram's magnanimity would soon be met with renewed divine assurance. Lot's decision to settle in the Jordan Valley set in motion events both prosperous and perilous for him. He moved his camp toward the cities of the plain, ultimately pitching his tents near Sodom, Genesis. Padinmundramani Panniranda Nimidam. In the eyes of that time, this was a logical economic choice. Sodom and the neighbouring cities sat in a fertile region, benefiting from the Jordan River and likely trade routes. Lot transitioned from a purely nomadic life toward a more settled existence among urbanized people. He would have interacted with the residents of Sodom, perhaps trading wool, meat, and milk from his flocks for city goods. The Bible, however, immediately adds an ominous note. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord, Genesis. Padinmundramani Padinmundra Nimidam, this foreshadows trouble ahead. Lot either underestimated the moral climate of his new neighbours, or felt he could manage the risks while enjoying the material advantages. Nonetheless, by choosing the valley, Lot exposed himself and his family to the corrupting influences and political turmoils of the city-states there. It's a classic scenario where a choice made by sight, the lush land, carried hidden costs for the soul. For Abram, Lot's choice meant that he now occupied the less apparently desirable land of Canaan's hills. But what might have looked like Abram's loss was about to be affirmed as his gain in a profound way. Shortly after Lot departed, God spoke to Abram again. Perhaps Abram, now alone with his household, wondered if yielding the best land had compromised the promise. God graciously dispelled any doubt. He told Abram, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. All the land that you see I will give to you and to your offspring forever. Genesis 13:14-15. This was a reaffirmation and expansion of the original promise. God essentially said, even the land Lot chose, eastward, remains part of what I intend for your descendants. God also reiterated the offspring promise with a vivid image. Abram's seed would be as countless as the dust of the earth. Standing perhaps on a hilltop in the clear Canaanite air, Abram could see far in every direction. Snow-capped Mount Hermon to the north, the hazy Negev to the south, the Jordan's valley to the east, and the Mediterranean's direction to the west. All of it, God said, would belong to his family in time. This divine confirmation must have thrilled Abram's heart. It was as if God said, "You have not lost anything by your generosity. Your inheritance is secure." God even invited Abram to Arise, walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I give it to you. Genesis 13:17 in ancient practice, that was a way to symbolically claim ownership, tread upon the land to mark it as yours. Abram obeyed in spirit. Moving his tent once more, he journeyed south to Hebron, in the plains of Mamre, and built yet another altar to the Lord there. Lot had chosen for himself. Abram had allowed God to choose for him. In the end, Abram got not only land, but the assurance of God's abiding promise, which was worth far more. The stage was now set for Abram to fully settle in Canaan, but soon events in Lot's new world would draw Abram into an unexpected conflict. Up to this point, Abram's challenges had been personal and domestic: famine, family strife, moral tests. Now a larger geopolitical conflict loomed that would entangle him: the first war recorded in the Bible. The peaceful region Lot moved into was under the shadow of imperial oppression. Genesis 14 describes a complex scenario. The valley of Siddim, the Dead Sea area, was dominated by a coalition of 4 kings from the east, led by Chedorlaomer of Elam. These eastern kings, from regions corresponding to Mesopotamia and beyond, had subjugated the city-states of the Jordan Plain, including Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar, Bela. For 12 years, the cities of the plain paid tribute to Chedorlaomer, essentially living under foreign rule. In the 13th year they rebelled, likely tired of heavy taxes or oppressive control. This rebellion sparked a military retaliation. Chedorlaomer and his allies, kings from Shinar, Elasar, and Goim, marched westward, ravaging as they went. They struck other peoples first, the Rephaim, Zuzim, Emim, and Horites, essentially crushing any potential allies the Jordan cities might have. The geopolitical picture here is one of an ambitious empire asserting dominance over a distant province. Such events are echoed in ancient texts outside the Bible, where coalitions of kings would go on campaigns to collect tribute and punish rebels. Scholars debate the historicity of Genesis 14, some seeing it as a rare glimpse of an early Bronze Age international conflict, others suggesting it's a later literary creation. Regardless, in Abram's narrative, it serves to propel him into a new role, that of a warrior rescuer. At this time, Abram himself was not directly involved in the politics of the Siddim Valley. Living in Hebron by the Oaks of Mamre, he was roughly 20 to 30 miles away from Lot's area. Abram had amicable relations with local Amorite chiefs, like Mamre, Eshcol, and Aner, but he was not under the rule of the Eastern kings. He stayed clear of that conflict initially. Yet, ominous news would soon reach him. The war had come to Sodom and Gomorrah, and it would impact his own kin. One can imagine the tension as reports filtered south to Abram's camp. Perhaps fleeing refugees or travelling merchants brought word of battles and cities falling. The shadow of war cast itself over the peaceful life Abram had rebuilt. It's notable that Abram, a man of tents and altars, suddenly gets swept into the tides of history's first recorded battle. This shows that even a life of faith lived quietly can be caught up in larger events. Abram was about to demonstrate that his faith included courage and a sense of justice, not just passive trust. The shadow of war would soon become very personal for the Patriarch of Peace. The rebellion of the Jordan Plain cities led to the Battle of Siddim, a dramatic confrontation in the Siddim Valley, which lay near the Dead Sea. In fact, Siddim is identified with the Salt Sea in Genesis 14:3. On one side were the 4 eastern kings, Chedorlaomer of Elam, Amraphel of Shinar, often associated with Babylon, Arioch of Elasar, and Tidal, king of nations. possibly a Hittite or Anatolian chief. On the other side were the 5 local kings of the plain, the rulers of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Bela, Zoar. The text gives a sense of being outmatched. The Eastern Coalition had already cut a swath of victory across Transjordan and the Negev, defeating various peoples. By the time they engaged the rebel kings in the Valley of Siddim, morale and odds were on the Easterners' side. The battle went poorly for the cities of the plain. The Valley of Siddim was full of bitumen, tar, pits, natural asphalt deposits, and as the local kings fled, some of their men fell into these pits while others fled to the hills. Genesis. 1410. It was a rout. Sodom and Gomorrah were sacked, their armies scattered. The victors plundered the cities, seizing goods, food and captives as spoils of war. In the chaos, Lot was caught up in the defeat. Lot had been dwelling in or near Sodom, and when Sodom fell, he and all his household and possessions were taken by the invaders. Genesis. 1411-12, Lot, who had chosen the good life in the valley, suddenly found himself a prisoner of war, his family and servants likely bound and herded with the other captives, and all his flocks confiscated. This turn of events starkly fulfilled the risks of Lot's choice. The once lush valley became a scene of smoke and despair as the foreign army marched away with loot and slaves in tow. One person managed to escape the carnage. A survivor, perhaps a servant of Lot's or a citizen of Sodom, fled the battle and made his way to Hebron, where Abram lived. Genesis. 1413. Panting and desperate, this fugitive delivered the shocking news. Lot, Abram's nephew, was captured and in grave danger. For Abram, this news was a call to action. The tranquil patriarch, who had thus far avoided entanglement in regional conflicts, now had skin in the game. His kinship loyalty and personal honour were at stake, not to mention love for Lot. The Battle of Siddim thus became Abram's concern overnight. It's worth noting the narrative pace. In just a few verses, Abram's world expands from domestic tents to international warfare. The man of peace would now need to wage war, a justified war of rescue. And so the stage was set for Abram to demonstrate an unexpected facet of his character, that of a bold and cunning warrior. Upon hearing that Lot was taken captive, Abram did not hesitate. He quickly marshalled a strike force from within his own household. The Bible notes that Abram mustered 318 trained men born in his house. Genesis. 1414. These were likely servants or retainers who had been with Abram long enough to be trusted and trained in combat, a necessity in a world where raiders and bandits could threaten flocks. This number hints at Abram's wealth and organisation. He had a private army of considerable size for the time. Additionally, Abram had allies, 3 local chiefs, Mamre, Eshcol and Anna, Amorite brothers who were confederates of Abram, 1413. With their support, Abram had a coalition of his own. Under the cover of urgency and perhaps stealth, Abram's forces pursued the invaders. The enemy coalition, burdened with plunder and captives, was travelling northward, likely heading back toward Mesopotamia via the Damascus trade route. Abram chased them all the way to Dan in the far north of Canaan, and then beyond to Hobah north of Damascus. Genesis. 1415. This is a journey of over 150 miles, a testament to Abram's resolve and the mobility of his men. It also shows strategic acumen. Abram caught up when the invaders were far from reinforcements, weary and encumbered. Abram executed a night attack, dividing his forces and striking the enemy camp under darkness. Genesis. 1415. This element of surprise, along with the enemy's likely fatigue, turned the tide. Abram's 318 men, plus allies, routed the much larger coalition by targeting them at their most vulnerable. It was a commando-style operation, swift and decisive. The defeated kings scattered, and Abram's forces pursued them, ensuring they wouldn't regroup quickly. In the process, Abram liberated all the captives, including Lot, and recovered the seized goods. One can imagine the scene as dawn broke. Grateful prisoners realizing they were free, camels and donkeys laden with reclaimed possessions, and Abram standing tall as the unexpected deliverer. This is a remarkable portrayal. Abram, often remembered for faith and fatherhood, here shines as a capable military leader. By ancient standards, his exploit would be legendary. A small band vanquishing a larger imperial force, something later echoed in biblical narratives of Gideon or David. Modern scholars might question the details, but the narrative's intent is clear. Abram's courage and God's providence won an improbable victory. Abram, motivated by kinship and righteousness, risked his life and assets to save his nephew from a fate of slavery or worse. It was an act of loyalty and justice, showing that the man of faith was also a man of action when needed. In rescuing Lot, Abram not only protected his family but also delivered the people of those cities from their captors, even though Sodom's residents were strangers to him. This shows Abram's broad sense of responsibility and mercy. With the battle won, Abram and his caravan of freed people and recaptured wealth turned back south. But before Abram could retreat into quiet life, he encountered two very different receptions on his way home, one from a mysterious priest king and one from a grateful, if morally bankrupt, king of Sodom. As Abram returned from his victory, laden with the goods and people he had recovered, he was met in the valley of Shaveh, likely near Jerusalem, by an intriguing figure, Melchizedek, the king of Salem. Salem is widely understood as the city of Jerusalem in its early form. Melchizedek is described as priest of God Most High, El Elyon, and king of Salem, Genesis. 1418, he brought out bread and wine to refresh Abram and his men, a gesture of hospitality and honour. Melchizedek then bestowed a blessing on Abram. Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. Genesis 14:19-20. This encounter is remarkable for several reasons. Melchizedek stands out as a worshipper of the same supreme God that Abram serves, despite being a Canaanite king. In a land of many gods, here is a priest king acknowledging the one creator of heaven and earth, and he recognizes Abram's victory as divinely given. It's a moment of spiritual validation and fellowship. The mysterious Melchizedek has no genealogy or backstory mentioned, which later made him a rich symbol in Jewish and Christian thought. Psalm 110 and the New Testament letter to the Hebrews make much of this. But in the narrative's context, Melchizedek likely was a local ruler of Jerusalem, Salem, who also led his city's worship of the highest deity they knew. His blessing affirmed that Abram's God was not a tribal deity but the sovereign of all. Abram responded to Melchizedek's blessing with profound respect. He gave Melchizedek a tenth of all the spoils, the first biblical mention of tithing, Genesis 1420. By giving a tithe, Abram acknowledged Melchizedek's priestly status and implicitly agreed that his victory was thanks to God Most High. This act connected Abram's faith with Melchizedek's, bridging a cultural gap. The bread and wine Melchizedek provided, simple yet symbolically rich staples, have often been seen by later interpreters as a foreshadowing of sacred meals. But in context, they simply provided physical and spiritual refreshment after battle. This scene is brief but powerful. It shows Abram not as a lone worshipper of God in Canaan, but as part of a broader acknowledgement of the true God's sovereignty, even among Gentile kings. It must have encouraged Abram that others recognized and honored his God. Melchizedek's title for God, Most High, and the blessing also emphasized that Abram's victory was not just military prowess, but divine providence. For Abram, fresh from combat, this encounter likely reinforced his faith that he was walking in a larger story guided by God. After Melchizedek's blessing and Abram's tithe, the priest king disappears from the narrative as suddenly as he came. But Abram's journey continues, now to face the king of Sodom, a starkly different meeting that would test Abram's integrity and success. The exchange between Abram and Melchizedek stands in stark contrast to what comes next with the king of Sodom. Melchizedek, as both priest and king of Salem, represented a righteous remnant in Canaan, acknowledging God Most High. By blessing Abram, he essentially confirmed that Abram was God's chosen instrument, a remarkable validation from a local authority. Abram's giving of the tithe, 10%, of the recovered goods to Melchizedek signified his reverence for God and respect for Melchizedek's priesthood. It was a voluntary act of worship and thanksgiving. This incident subtly indicates that Abram did not consider all the war spoils to be his by right. He immediately set aside a portion for God through God's priest. By doing so, Abram avoided the temptation of greed after a victory. He recognized a higher claim on the loot, namely honoring the divine giver of victory. Melchizedek's mention in the narrative is brief but packs theological weight. He used the name El Elyon, God Most High, and identified that God with Yahweh by calling him creator of heaven and earth and by crediting him for Abram's triumph. Abram in turn embraced this language. In the next verses he swears an oath by the Lord God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. Genesis 14:22, showing he fully aligns his God with Melchizedek's reference. Essentially, Melchizedek helped publicly frame Abram's victory as not just a lucky break or personal prowess, but as an act of the supreme God of the universe. This framing was crucial for what happened when the king of Sodom arrived. It's also a beautiful moment of fellowship. Abram likely felt encouraged that he wasn't the only monotheist around. In a foreign land, here was a neighbour who actually honoured the same God. That must have strengthened Abram's resolve to continue trusting and obeying God's unique call on his life. The blessing assured Abram that God's promise of blessing, "I will bless those who bless you," God had said in Genesis. 12:3 was already coming true. Melchizedek blessed Abram, and in turn was honoured by Abram. With that uplifting encounter concluded, Abram turned to face the king of Sodom, who had also come to meet him. This next interaction would put into practice the convictions Abram had just affirmed, whether he truly credited God for success or would seek personal gain. Not long after Melchizedek's departure, Abram was approached by the king of Sodom, one of the very rulers he had just rescued from defeat. This king had fled in battle, but now he returned, no doubt grateful but also focused on his interests. He proposed a deal to Abram: "Give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself." Genesis 14:21. In other words, the king of Sodom asked for his captured citizens back, but was willing to let Abram keep all the material spoils of war, the livestock, riches and goods that had been looted from Sodom and the other cities. This offer might seem generous or even just. After all, Abram had won them back. But consider Sodom's reputation for wickedness. Accepting the wealth of Sodom could attach Abram's name to that infamy, or later lead to Sodomites claiming Abram grew rich off their loss. Abram sensed a moral and spiritual danger here. He immediately declined the offer in striking terms. "I have sworn an oath to the Lord, God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, that I will not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you should say, 'I have made Abram rich.'" Genesis 14:22-23. Abram's response echoes Melchizedek's language. God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, showing Abram acting out of a principle he had just re-emphasized, that his blessing comes from God alone. By refusing even a shoelace from Sodom's king, Abram preserved the purity of the testimony that God was his provider. He did not want his growing wealth to be credited to a pagan king's handout or the fortunes of war. This was a moment of integrity and faith. It would have been tempting to accept the huge reward. Materially, it could set up Abram for life. But spiritually, Abram discerned that a line must be drawn. He didn't want to be in league with Sodom's king or indebted to him. This refusal also demonstrated remarkable selflessness. Abram was okay giving up what could be considered rightfully his, by conquest, to uphold a higher principle. He only asked that his allies, Mamre, Eshcol and Anna, receive their fair share for their help, and that his men had eaten some of the food be considered. Genesis 14:24. Abram's stance would leave a strong impression. The king of Sodom got his people and goods, minus the tithe to Melchizedek, back without cost, solely due to Abram's mercy and honour. Abram, having risked life and limb for justice, took no payment, making him morally superior to the king he saved. This incident likely enhanced Abram's reputation among the Canaanites as a righteous and independent leader. It also deepened his reliance on God. By turning down riches, he once again put his future finances in God's hands. Abram walked away from that meeting with perhaps fewer sheep and trinkets, but with a soul at peace and a testimony intact. This refusal of Sodom's reward closes the curtain on the war episode. Abram returned to his tents by the oaks of Mamre, having been a peacemaker and a liberator, and ready to receive the next stage of God's unfolding promise. Some time after Abram's victory and his principled stand with the king of Sodom, God initiated a profound encounter with Abram to reinforce the divine promises. In Genesis 15, we find Abram perhaps in a contemplative mood. He had seen God's protection in battle, but he still had no offspring to inherit the blessings. God spoke to him in a vision, beginning with the words, "Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great." Genesis 15:1. This reassurance directly addressed any lingering fear, maybe retaliation from the eastern kings, and Abram's forfeiting of Sodom's reward. God was basically saying, I will personally be your protector and provider, far exceeding any earthly reward. Abram, however, voiced a deep concern. O Lord God, what will you give me, for I continue childless? 15:2. He lamented that without a son, a servant, Eliezer of Damascus, stood to inherit his estate. This candid prayer reveals Abram's heart. He believed God's promise of land and blessing, but the missing piece was an heir from his own body. God responded not with rebuke, but with a memorable visual aid. He brought Abram outside his tent into the cool night and said, "Look toward heaven and number the stars, if you're able to count them. So shall your offspring be." Genesis. 15.5 Under the dark Near Eastern sky, studded with countless stars, Abram received a promise that redefined numerous. His descendants would be as uncountable as the stars above. It was an expansion of the earlier dust of the earth metaphor, both ground and sky testifying to an innumerable progeny. In that moment, something quietly monumental happened in Abram's heart. Abram believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness in Genesis. 15:6. This single verse would echo for millennia. Abram's simple trust in God's word, accepting that an old man with no child would become the father of multitudes, was credited by God as righteousness. In other words, faith became the basis of Abram's right standing with God. This concept is central in Judeo-Christian theology, that trusting God's promise is what pleases him most. Abram didn't earn this status by works or heroics, though he had those. It was his faith that God delighted in. The starry sky covenant moment assured Abram that despite all odds, he would have a legacy. Perhaps tears filled Abram's eyes as he gazed upward, each star now a glimmer of hope for children and grandchildren to come. He might have recalled that years ago God promised to make him a great nation. Now God was quantifying that promise in the countless stars. This exchange under the cosmos was intimate and profound. A covenant conversation between a friend of God, as Abram is later called, and the Almighty. It underscores that the crux of Abram's journey was always about faith. The land promise was reiterated too. God reminded Abram that he brought him from Ur to give you this land to possess. 15:7. When Abram asked for assurance, God graciously formalized the covenant in a tangible ritual next. But at the heart of it was Abram's faith, shining as brightly as the stars above. To solidify his promises, God enacted a covenant ceremony with Abram in Genesis 15. In ancient Near Eastern culture, covenant making often involved animal sacrifices and symbolic actions to underscore the binding nature of the agreement. God instructed Abram to bring specific animals: a 3-year-old heifer, a goat, a ram, a turtle dove, and a pigeon. Abram prepared them by slaughtering and splitting the larger animals in two, laying the halves opposite each other, creating a path between them. This might seem gruesome to us, but Abram understood its meaning. Such rituals were essentially a way of saying, "May this fate befall me," the split animals, "if I break this covenant." Normally, both parties to a covenant would walk between the pieces swearing an oath of loyalty. Abram waited by the carcasses, driving away scavenger birds that swooped down. As the sun set, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a terrifying great darkness came over him, a sign that something awesome and solemn was happening. In that state, God spoke to Abram, giving him a prophetic glimpse of the future. God revealed that Abram's descendants would be strangers in a foreign land for 400 years, enslaved and oppressed, but God would judge that nation and bring Abram's seed out with great possessions. This, as readers know, foreshadows the Israelites' sojourn in Egypt in the Exodus. God also told Abram he would die in peace at a good old age, and that in the 4th generation his descendants would return to Canaan, for the sin of the Amorites is not yet complete. 15:16. This indicates that part of the delay in inheriting the land was due to God's justice. The current inhabitants, Amorites, Canaanites, had a measure of time until their wickedness warranted dispossession. When darkness had fully fallen, the covenant was dramatically sealed. A smoking firepot and a flaming torch appeared and passed between the animal pieces, 15:17. These objects represented God's presence, akin to the pillar of cloud and fire that would later lead Israel. Crucially, Abram did not pass between the pieces. Only God, symbolized by the smoke and fire, did, indicating this was a unilateral covenant bound by God's own oath. God was essentially saying, I stake my own being on fulfilling these promises to you." Thus the covenant was formally established. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, "To your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates," 15:18, and enumerating the peoples who occupied it, Canaanites, Hittites, etc. The geographical scope from Nile, or its eastern branch, to Euphrates outlined the ideal extent of the promised land in broad strokes. This was a far greater territory than Abram currently sojourned in. It anticipated a numerous people needing a large land. For Abram, this covenant ceremony must have been overwhelming. He experienced a theophany, visible manifestation of God, and received both promise and prophecy. The cut animals, the mysterious fire, the spoken pledge, all would be indelibly burned into his memory. If ever Abram harboured doubts afterward, he could recall that night when God himself walked the blood path of covenant, binding his word to Abram's future. This covenant undergirds the rest of the biblical narrative. It's why later generations speak of the covenant with Abraham, a foundational promise of land, nationhood and blessing. As Abram woke to a new dawn after that dark night, he carried a covenant guarantee that neither time nor tribulation could annul. God's promise was as good as done. Only the unfolding of history stood between Abram and its fulfillment. Despite the grandeur of the covenant, years continued to pass without Sarai conceiving a child. Abram and Sarai were aging, Abram nearing 85, Sarai about 75, and Sarai in particular felt the sting of barrenness acutely. In that cultural context, a woman's worth was often tied to motherhood, and Sarai had borne the burden of infertility for decades. The pressure to produce an heir for Abram grew with each passing season. Sarai's faith in God's promise may have wavered, or perhaps she thought she wasn't the intended mother. So Sarai proposed a plan B that was socially acceptable at the time. She offered her Egyptian maidservant Hagar to Abram as a surrogate wife, Genesis 16:1-2. This was not a scandalous idea in their society. Contemporary ancient laws, like the Code of Hammurabi, allowed that if a wife was barren, she could give her maid to her husband, and any child born would be counted as the wife's own. Sarai explicitly said, "It may be that I shall obtain children by her." Abram, perhaps out of desperation or simply acquiescing to keep peace, agreed to Sarai's suggestion. After all, 10 years in Canaan had yielded no pregnancy for Sarai, and maybe this was how God intended to fulfill the promise of offspring. Hagar became Abram's concubine, secondary wife, and soon conceived. For the first time, Abram would be a father, but the dynamics in the household shifted dramatically. Hagar, now pregnant, began to look down on her mistress. Genesis 16:4 says, "When she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress." Perhaps Hagar gloated or felt superior now that she carried the master's child, something Sarai could not do. This infuriated Sarai. She complained to Abram, venting her hurt and jealousy. "I gave my servant to your embrace, and now that she sees she's pregnant, I am despised in her eyes. May the Lord judge between you and me." 16:5. It's a bit ironic Sarai initiated the plan, but now blames Abram for the fallout. Abram, caught in the domestic crossfire, essentially handed Hagar back under Sarai's full authority. "Your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please." Genesis 16:6. Sarai then dealt harshly with Hagar. We're not given details, but she likely made life miserable for the young expectant mother, perhaps heavy workloads, verbal abuse, or open humiliation. Eventually, Hagar fled into the wilderness, preferring the uncertainty of desert life to Sarai's harsh treatment. This episode reveals the consequences of impatience and taking matters into one's own hands. Abram and Sarai's decision, while culturally normal, was a deviation from waiting on God's timing. The result was domestic strife, bitterness between Sarai and Hagar, and distress for Abram. In a way, they tried to help God's promise along, but it led to dysfunction. Importantly, though this plan was not born out of strong faith, God did not abandon the situation or the people involved. Instead, God would show grace to Hagar and bring good even out of this flawed attempt. It's also noteworthy that Hagar was Egyptian, possibly one of the maidservants acquired during Abram's sojourn in Egypt. Thus, a consequence of that earlier detour, Egypt, now entangled with the consequence of this detour from faith. Yet, through it all, God was watching and ready to intervene. The story of Hagar and Ishmael was about to become a chapter of its own within Abram's saga, illustrating God's care for the marginalised and his ability to write straight with crooked lines. Pregnant and miserable, Hagar fled Sarai's mistreatment. She journeyed south, heading perhaps back toward her homeland Egypt, and stopped by a spring in the wilderness of Shur, Genesis 16:7. There, the angel of the Lord found her. This is a significant moment. Hagar, an enslaved woman and foreigner, becomes the first person in Scripture to receive a direct angelic encounter. The angel called her Hagar, servant of Sarai, acknowledging her identity and situation, and asked, "Where have you come from and where are you going?" 16.8. Hagar candidly replied that she was running away from her mistress Sarai. The angel gave Hagar unexpected counsel. "Return to your mistress and submit to her," Genesis 16:9. This might seem hard, go back to the very hardship she'd escaped, but it came with a promise that transformed Hagar's outlook. The angel spoke words of blessing eerily similar to those given to Abram. "I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude," Genesis 16:10. In other words, the child Hagar carried was not an accident. He would be the start of a great lineage. The angel then revealed more. Hagar was to name her son Ishmael, meaning God hears, "For the Lord has listened to your affliction," Genesis 16:11. God had seen Hagar's suffering and was responding. Ishmael, the angel said, would be a wild donkey of a man, fiercely independent, living in the wilderness, and at odds with his kin, Genesis 16:12. This wasn't exactly a rosy character portrait, but it foretold that Ishmael would be strong and free, not a slave. Gratitude and awe overwhelmed Hagar. She realized she had encountered God's messenger, even God himself in some form, and she gave a name to the Lord who spoke to her, El Roi, the God who sees me, for she said, "Truly here I've seen him who looks after me," Genesis 16:13. It's touching that Hagar, an Egyptian servant, attributes a personal name to God based on her experience. She felt seen and cared for by the Almighty. The spring where this occurred was thereafter called Bir Lahai Roi, meaning well of the living one who sees me. Strengthened by this divine encounter, Hagar obeyed and returned to Abram's camp. In due time, Hagar bore Abram a son. Abram, now 86 years old, named the boy Ishmael, as the angel instructed. Likely Hagar relayed the command, or Abram himself received it. For Abram, Ishmael's birth must have been a mix of joy and complexity. Here was his firstborn son, flesh of his flesh, ending a long wait for offspring. Abram no doubt loved Ishmael, yet Ishmael was not Sarai's son, and the household tensions likely continued beneath the surface. Still, at this point, Abram might have assumed Ishmael was the promised heir. For 13 years after Ishmael's birth, no further word from God is recorded. Abram watched Ishmael grow into a teenager, perhaps grooming him to inherit the leadership of the tribe one day. The name God hears was a constant reminder of God's mercy and hardship. God heard Hagar's cries and blessed her son. Ishmael's upbringing in Abram's tents meant he was raised with knowledge of Abram's God and ways. However, the prophecy of Ishmael's wild nature suggests he would also embody a different spirit. Untamed, contentious, living on the fringes. Indeed, Ishmael would become the ancestor of many Arab tribes, fulfilling the promise of multiplying his descendants. Hagar's story, though born of human impatience, displayed God's compassion. He saw a single mother in distress, and not only rescued her, but folded her story into the grand tapestry of Abraham's legacy. Ishmael was not the child of covenant promise, that chapter was yet to come, but he was not outside God's care or plans. Abraham's family now included this half-Egyptian boy, and heaven had spoken destiny over him. The stage was set for a clearer demarcation of promise, which God would soon address when he next appeared to Abram to reaffirm and refine the covenant. 13 years after Ishmael's birth, when Abram was 99 years old, God appeared again to deepen and formalize the covenant in a new way, Genesis 17. God introduced himself with a new name, El Shaddai, often translated God Almighty, and commanded Abram, "Walk before me and be blameless," 17:1. This was a call to continued faithfulness and an introduction to a significant covenant expansion. God reiterated his promise to multiply Abram exceedingly, and Abram fell on his face in reverence. Then God gave Abram a new identity marker. No longer shall your name be Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, 17:5. Abram meant exalted father, but Abraham means father of a multitude. By renaming him, God was sealing into Abraham's very name the destiny of countless descendants. It was a tangible daily reminder whenever anyone said Abraham that he is the father of multitudes, even if at that moment the multitude was one teenager. God further elaborated the covenant. He would make Abraham exceedingly fruitful. Nations and kings would descend from him. And crucially, this was an everlasting covenant not just with Abraham, but with his offspring through their generations. And God promised, "I will be their God," 17:7. The land of Canaan, where Abraham was still a foreigner, would be given to his descendants as an everlasting possession. These sweeping promises reaffirmed and expanded everything earlier, putting heavy emphasis on perpetuity and on a special relationship between God and Abraham's lineage. To signify this covenant, God introduced a physical sign, circumcision. "This is my covenant, which you shall keep. Every male among you shall be circumcised," Genesis 17:10. Abraham and every male in his household, including servants and foreign-born slaves, were to be circumcised in the flesh of their foreskins, and every baby boy on the 8th day after birth going forward. This was a common practice in some ancient cultures. Egyptians and others practiced circumcision too. But here it took on a unique covenantal meaning. It was a mark in the very body of Abraham's family to set them apart as belonging to God's promise. It was also a personal and somewhat painful act of obedience, a constant remembrance that their fertility and offspring were dedicated to God. God said any uncircumcised male would be cut off from his people for breaking the covenant, 17:14, underscoring the seriousness. Abraham at 99 demonstrated immediate obedience. That very day he circumcised himself, Ishmael, 13 years old, and every male in his household, 17:23-27. It was an act of faith and submission. We can imagine this was not easy physically or logistically, but Abraham understood the significance. This was the seal of the covenant, akin to signing on the dotted line. Each cut was a declaration that we are God's covenant people. God also addressed Sarai in this encounter. "As for Sarai your wife, you shall not call her Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name." Genesis 17:15. Sarai and Sarah essentially mean the same, princess, but the change perhaps signified a new status or affirmation. And then the stunning news, "I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her," 17:16. Sarah, age 90, well past childbearing, was named as the mother of the promised child. God promised to bless her, and that she would give rise to nations and kings. Abraham's reaction was visceral. He fell on his face and laughed, 17:17. It was a laugh of amazement and perhaps incredulity. Shall a child be born to a man who is 100? Shall Sarah, who is 90, bear a child, he wondered. Abraham even offered a suggestion, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you," 17:18, implying, "Can't Ishmael fulfill this promise? He's already here, I love him, let's work with that." But God gently but firmly clarified, "No, but Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac." Genesis 17:19. Isaac means he laughs, immortalizing Abraham's laugh and soon Sarah's. God promised to establish the everlasting covenant with Isaac, the yet-to-be-born son of Sarah, while also hearing Abraham's plea for Ishmael. God did bless Ishmael, promising to make him fruitful, multiply him exceedingly, and make him a great nation with 12 princes. But the covenant would pass through Isaac, Genesis 17:20-21. With that, God finished speaking, and Abraham took up the flint knife to perform the circumcisions as commanded. This chapter marks a profound turning point. Abraham and Sarah are explicitly named as the progenitors of the covenant line, Isaac is promised by name, and circumcision becomes the enduring sign of belonging to God's chosen family. The stage was now set for the long-awaited miraculous birth. Abraham's household, freshly circumcised and carrying new names, waited in faith for the fulfillment of God's word as Abraham's 100th year of life approached. Not long after the covenant of circumcision, Abraham had a remarkable encounter that added a deeply personal dimension to God's promise. He was by his tent at the oaks of Mamre in the heat of the day, likely resting, when he looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. Genesis 18:1-2. These men were no ordinary travellers. The text reveals one was the Lord himself in human form, accompanied by two angels, though Abraham initially didn't fully grasp their identity. Abraham sprang into action, demonstrating the famed Middle Eastern hospitality that was a cornerstone of his culture and his character. He ran to greet them, bowed low and entreated them, "My lord, if I have found favour in your sight, do not pass by your servant." 18:3. Using humble language, he offered water to wash their feet and a place to rest under the tree. Then he hurried to prepare a lavish meal. He asked Sarah to quickly bake bread from fine flour, and he selected a tender calf for a servant to butcher and roast. He brought curds, yogurt, and milk, and the freshly baked bread and meat, setting this feast before the visitors under the shade of the oak trees. Abraham, nearly 100, personally waited on them as they ate, standing by like an attentive host. 18.8. This scene paints a charming picture of nomadic hospitality. Generous, bustling, and heartfelt. As the guests dined, they conversed with Abraham. One of them asked, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" 18:9. This must have caught Abraham's attention. How did this stranger know Sarah's name? Abraham replied that she was in the tent. As was custom, Sarah stayed out of sight while male guests were present, but she was listening at the tent's entrance. Then came the startling pronouncement, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife shall have a son." 18:10. This was the first time a concrete timetable was given for the promise. Sarah, eavesdropping from behind the tent flap, reacted in a very human way. She laughed to herself. 18:12. It was an inner, possibly cynical laugh. "After I am worn out, and my lord is old, shall I have pleasure?" At 90, the idea of pregnancy was absurd to her, and perhaps even the pleasure of marital intimacy was long past or not leading to hope of conception. The Lord, as one of the visitors is identified, knew her inner thoughts. He said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I'm old?' Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time, Sarah shall have a son." 18:13-14. Caught off guard, Sarah denied laughing, perhaps stepping out to protest. "I did not laugh," out of fear. But the Lord gently insisted, "No, but you did laugh." 18:15. There was no rebuke beyond that, just a knowing affirmation. Sarah's laugh of doubt was noted, and the child's name Isaac, laughter, would forever remind them of this moment. This encounter served multiple purposes. It reconfirmed the promise of Isaac with a clear timeline, within a year. And it did so in a way that directly involved Sarah, addressing her skepticism. Secondly, it further revealed the nature of God to Abraham and Sarah. Personal, tangible, and able to share a meal in fellowship. Abraham's hospitality ended up being extended to the Lord himself unawares. A scenario so iconic that later scriptures, Hebrews 13:2, reference it as an example of entertaining angels without knowing. The question, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" resonated as a challenge to any remaining doubt. It's a rhetorical question with a resounding answer. No, nothing is too hard. The laws of age and biology bow to the Creator. This question would bolster Abraham and Sarah's faith as they moved into the final stretch of awaiting Isaac's birth. After the meal and message, the visitors rose to depart, and Abraham walked with them a ways. But the day's revelations weren't over. The Lord had another purpose for visiting Abraham, related to the neighbouring cities. Still, the promise delivered at Mamre was the last assurance needed before the miraculous fulfilment. Sarah's incredulous laughter would turn into joyful laughter soon enough, as the Lord turned the impossible into reality. The scene at Mamre highlights a key virtue embodied by Abraham: hospitality. In the ancient Near East, hospitality was not merely a courteous practice, it was a sacred duty. Travellers depended on the goodwill of strangers for survival in harsh environments. A host was expected to provide food, water, and protection to anyone who came to his door. Abraham excelled in this duty, showing generosity and respect even before he knew his guests were divine messengers. In fact, his behaviour sets a benchmark for hospitality that has been celebrated through the ages. The rabbis and church fathers alike pointed to Abraham at Mamre as the model of welcoming strangers. Notice how Abraham addressed the leader of the three as "my lord," a term of respect, and referred to himself as "your servant." He hurried. There was enthusiasm in his service, not reluctance. He offered a little water and a morsel of bread, underplaying the lavish feast he actually provided. This humble way of extending hospitality, under promise over-deliver, is a sign of his modesty and desire not to impose on the guest's sense of obligation. Sarah too played a part behind the scenes, baking cakes from fine flour, likely a form of the best pita or flatbread. The young servant prepared a tender calf, indicating a special meal since meat was not everyday fare for pastoralists, it was for honoured guests. Abraham personally served curds, a form of yogurt or soft cheese, and milk, which alongside meat in one meal is interesting given later Israelite dietary customs, but at this time it signified abundance. Abraham's choice to stand by attentively while the guests ate rather than sitting to eat with them was a mark of deference, treating them like royalty. This kind of hospitality was not offered with an expectation of payment or favour. It was the ethos of kindness for its own sake. Unbeknownst to Abraham, his open-hearted welcome set the stage for divine revelation. It reminds us that sometimes great blessings come when we least expect them, often in the midst of performing simple acts of kindness. Indeed, had Abraham been less hospitable or ignored the three men, imagine what he might have missed. This encourages a perspective that every stranger could bear a blessing or a lesson. Additionally, Abraham's hospitality had an evangelistic or witness aspect. Through his gracious behaviour, the Lord, in human form, engaged in intimate fellowship with him. It's a subtle indication that God values traits like generosity, humility, and service, so much that he partakes in the meal. There's also a cultural snapshot here of how communal and familial hospitality was. Abraham engages Sarah and his servant in the endeavour, implying that the whole household participated in welcoming guests. It was a team effort reflective of their household's values. The narrative leaves a strong impression that hospitality is a conduit for encountering the divine and for reinforcing covenant relationship. After all, the reaffirmation of Sarah's impending motherhood happened in the context of a shared meal. In the broader biblical theme, this foreshadows the idea of table fellowship with God, later seen in concepts like the Lord's Supper or the Messianic banquet. Abraham's simple act of feeding strangers became a holy moment. Thus, the story encourages readers to emulate Abraham's hospitality, suggesting that by doing so, we might find ourselves surprisingly close to God's work and presence. As the book of Hebrews later exhorts, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares, a direct nod to Abraham's experience at Mamre. After the meal at Mamre, the three visitors got up to continue their journey, which, as the narrative now reveals, was towards Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham walked with them to see them off. Here the tone shifts from joyous promise to somber deliberation. The Lord pondered, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do?" General 18 mani 17 nimidam. This rhetorical question underscored Abraham's role as a confidant of God, someone with whom God chose to share his plans. God reasoned that since Abraham would surely become a great nation and a source of blessing, and since God had chosen him to teach righteousness and justice to his offspring, it was fitting to involve him in divine justice about to unfold. Thus, the Lord revealed to Abraham the grievous situation. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grave. 1820. God expressed intent to go down and see whether they had done altogether according to the outcry that had come to him. 1821. This anthropomorphic language, "I will go down and see," signals a thorough investigation, even though God already knows. It communicates that divine judgment is never capricious, but grounded in verified moral reality. The outcry likely refers to the cry of victims oppressed by those cities' wickedness, or a metaphorical cry of the land itself due to extreme sin. Sodom and Gomorrah had a reputation for depravity and cruelty, which later scriptures confirm. Ezekiel 16:49 highlights arrogance, gluttony, and indifference to the poor. Jude 1:7 emphasizes sexual immorality. Their wickedness was so flagrant that it was proverbial. For Abraham, this news hit close to home, literally. His nephew Lot lived in Sodom. Abraham had recently rescued those cities' population, including Lot, from captivity. Now, a worse fate loomed. The two angels went on ahead towards Sodom while Abraham remained standing before the Lord. 1822. Here we see Abraham in a new light, not as warrior or host, but as intercessor. He approached and asked the famous question, "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" Abraham's sense of justice was stirred. He, who had taught his household righteousness and justice, now respectfully challenged God on those very principles. It's a bold and profound moment, a human holding a kind of respectful negotiation with the Almighty. Abraham proposed a scenario. If there were 50 righteous people in Sodom, would God spare the city for their sake? He appealed to God's character. Far be it from you to do such a thing. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? This wasn't insolence. It was a plea grounded in trust that God is indeed just and merciful. Abraham's underlying concern was clearly for Lot and perhaps any others in those cities who were innocent or godly, but he framed it in universal terms. The Lord responded affirmatively. If he found 50 righteous in Sodom, he would spare the whole place for their sake. 1826. Encouraged, Abraham pressed further, carefully lowering the number, 45, 40, 30, 20, and finally 10. Each time asking if the city would be spared for that many righteous, and each time God agreed. 1827 to 32. 10 was Abraham's final proposal. Perhaps he thought surely at least 10 righteous individuals might be found, maybe Lot's family and a few others. This negotiation is striking for its perseverance and humility. Abraham repeatedly acknowledged his dust and ashes status and God's patience, yet also persistently advocated for mercy. It highlights the concept that a minority of righteous people can uphold or bless a whole community. God was willing to spare thousands of wicked for the sake of 10 good souls, an extraordinary testament to his mercy and the value he places on the righteous. Unfortunately, as the narrative soon shows, even 10 could not be found in Sodom. But Abraham didn't know that yet. He did all he could in pleading. Abraham's intercession shows a growth in his relationship with God. He's not afraid to engage deeply with God's ethical nature. It's also the first extended prayer for others recorded in Scripture, setting a pattern for believers caring about the fate of even the wicked and appealing to God's mercy. It reveals that while God hears the outcry of victims, he also hears the pleas of intercessors. Abraham's prayer didn't save the cities for lack of 10 righteous, but it likely saved Lot and his daughters, as the next chapter implies that God remembered Abraham when he delivered Lot, Genesis. With the term set at 10, the Lord ended the conversation and Abraham returned home, 1833. The stage was now set for the fateful judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah, while Abraham, from a distance, awaited what would happen, having entrusted the matter to the judge of all the earth. Abraham's intercession for Sodom stands as one of the most audacious and compassionate prayers in the Bible. Alone before the Lord, Abraham took on the role of a defense attorney, pleading for mercy on behalf of a city steeped in sin. His motivation was likely twofold: personal concern for Lot's family and a broader desire to see mercy triumph over judgment. Abraham started respectfully but boldly. Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Implicitly he was saying, surely it's against your nature, God, to slay the innocent with the guilty. Wouldn't you, in your justice, spare the whole city if there were a critical mass of good people there? What's fascinating is Abraham's underlying theology. He believed a small number of righteous individuals could effectively save a whole population. This is the inverse of collective guilt. It's collective salvation by association. And God agreed to this principle, indicating his willingness to show extraordinary leniency for the sake of the few. As Abraham carefully lowered the threshold, what about 45, 40, 30, 20, Sib? One can sense both his growing confidence in God's mercy and his realism about Sodom's depravity. Each time he secures God's assurance that if that number of righteous is found, he will not destroy the city. Abraham was persistent but also self-effacing. I who am but dust and ashes have taken it upon myself to speak to the Lord, 1827. He apologized for his boldness even as he continued to be bold. This reveals an important aspect of effective intercession: humility paired with tenacity. Abraham was keenly aware of his unworthiness, yet he was driven by love and a sense of justice to keep asking. This combination pleased God enough that he engaged in the dialogue rather than dismissing Abraham. It shows God's openness to the influence of righteous prayer, not that God changes his character, but he invites humans to align with his mercy, and in doing so can shape outcomes. Why stop at 10? The text doesn't say explicitly. Perhaps Abraham thought 10 was the minimum communal unit. Maybe Lot's family roughly counted 10. Lot, his wife, 2 daughters, maybe sons-in-law or betrothed sons-in-law, plus a few others who might have been righteous. Or perhaps Abraham felt he'd pressed as far as was seemly. Regardless, with 10 as the final benchmark, the conversation ended. Abraham's prayer didn't avert the fiery judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah in the end, because as chapter 19 unfolds, not even 10 righteous were found. Only Lot, and arguably his 2 daughters, met the criteria, as even Lot's wife's loyalties were compromised. However, Abraham's intercession was not in vain. It's explicitly noted in Genesis 19:29 that God remembered Abraham and delivered Lot out of the catastrophe. So in effect, Abraham's prayer did save the few righteous, Lot's family, out of the many wicked. His prayer perhaps also served to satisfy Abraham that divine justice would not be arbitrary. He gained insight into God's willingness to show mercy, and also the sobering reality that Sodom was beyond the point of even a minion quorum of righteous people. This story cements Abraham's reputation as not only a man of faith, but a man of compassion. He cared about the fate of others, even those who weren't covenant members or particularly deserving. It prefigures Moses interceding for Israel, or Jesus weeping over Jerusalem, the heart of an intercessor aligned with God's love for souls. Abraham's negotiation also underscored a truth echoed later by prophets. A righteous remnant can uphold a nation. Jeremiah 5:1 similarly seeks one righteous man to pardon Jerusalem. In Sodom's case, there was no remnant to be found. Abraham returned to his tent on the hills, and by next morning he would witness the smoke of Sodom's destruction rising, confirming that not 10 righteous lived there. That sight must have been sobering, yet Abraham could trust that the judge of all the earth had done right, and his own nephew had been mercifully extracted. The narrative thus concludes the Sodom episode with Abraham as a compassionate intercessor, who reflected God's own mercy, even as God carried out justice when mercy was exhausted by human unrepentance. Abraham's legacy here teaches future generations about the power of standing in the gap for others, praying fervently for mercy until there truly is no remedy. Meanwhile, the 2 angels, in human form, who had left Abraham arrived in Sodom by evening, Genesis 19:1. There they encountered Lot sitting in the city gate, a place where elders or influential figures often gathered. Perhaps Lot had attained some status in Sodom, or he was waiting uneasily after hearing rumours of these strangers' journey. Lot saw the angels, and much like his uncle Abraham, he rose to meet them and bowed face to the ground, offering hospitality. "My lords, please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night," Lot urged, also offering a foot wash and an early send-off in the morning, 19:2. The angels initially said, "No, we will spend the night in the town square," testing perhaps the city's character firsthand. But Lot insisted strongly until they agreed to come under his roof, 19:3. Lot prepared a feast, and unleavened bread for them. It seems hospitality ran in the family, though Lot's might not have been as lavish, and the urgency, unleavened bread quickly made, hints he knew the dangers of nighttime in Sodom. Sure enough, before the visitors could sleep, the men of Sodom surrounded Lot's house. Young and old, all the people from every quarter, Genesis 19:4. This phrasing emphasizes how pervasive the wickedness was, a mob including youths and elders from all parts of the city. They shouted for Lot to bring out his guests so they could abuse them, so that we may know them, a biblical euphemism for sexual assault, 19:5. This horrific demand confirmed Sodom's depravity and the outcry that had reached God. Here was a blatant display of injustice, cruelty, and violation of the sacred duty of hospitality. Lot stepped outside, shutting the door behind him, and begged them not to act wickedly. In a morally desperate attempt, Lot even offered his 2 virgin daughters to the mob to placate them, saying, "Do to them as you please," Genesis 19:8, an action we rightly find appalling. Lot's judgment was compromised. He was trying to uphold guest right at an unthinkable cost. It shows how living in Sodom had perhaps dulled Lot's moral clarity. He chose what he saw as the lesser of 2 evils, but it was still horribly evil. The crowd, however, wasn't interested in the women. They wanted the male visitors. They grew hostile, telling Lot to stand back and accusing him, a foreigner, of acting as a judge over them. They threatened to treat Lot worse than the men inside and lunged at him to break down the door, 19:9. At that critical moment, the angels opened the door, yanked Lot inside to safety, and struck the mob outside with blindness, 19:10-11. Suddenly, the attackers couldn't find the doorway or presumably even each other. Chaos and panic likely ensued among them. The supernatural blindness halted the immediate threat. The depravity of Sodom had been fully exposed. Not even the basic rules of decency toward guests or the pleas of a resident could restrain their violent lust. This night's event sealed Sodom's fate. The angels had their evidence. They told Lot, "We're about to destroy this place, because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord," 1913. They asked if Lot had any others in the city, sons-in-law, sons, daughters, to get them out. Lot rushed to warn the two men betrothed to his daughters, but they thought he was joking, 1914. At dawn, the angels urged Lot to hurry out with his wife and daughters. Still, Lot lingered, perhaps heart-wrenched or in denial. The angels had to physically grab the hands of Lot, his wife and daughters, and lead them outside the city, the Lord being merciful to him, 1916. Once out, they commanded them to flee to the mountains and not look back. They allowed Lot's plea to instead escape to a small nearby town, Zoar, to survive. Then, as the sun had risen, God rained down sulphur and fire from heaven onto Sodom and Gomorrah, 1924. The language implies a cataclysm, whether supernatural or via natural, means like a massive earthquake or meteor airburst. The result was the same. The cities and the entire plain were obliterated, their structures and inhabitants consumed. Smoke billowed up like the smoke of a furnace, 1928. In the process, Lot's wife disobeyed the warning and looked back, perhaps longingly or in defiance, and she was turned into a pillar of salt, 1926. A mysterious fate likely meaning she was swept up in the sulphurous fallout and preserved as a salt-encrusted remnant, given the Dead Sea region's geology. Abraham, from his vantage on the heights, saw the dense smoke rising from the plain. The destruction was total, a stark demonstration of divine judgment. The wicked had been swept away. Not even a remnant of 10 righteous could be found. Only Lot and his 2 daughters survived by escaping to Zoar, and ironically, they soon left Zoar to live in a cave in the hills, 1930, fearing it was not safe either. The Bible later recalls Sodom and Gomorrah as bywords for God's wrath on extreme sin. Their ruins a grim memorial visible in Abraham's time and beyond. For Abraham, the destruction answered the question. Even if 10 righteous weren't there, God did deliver the one, Lot, who was righteous for Abraham's sake. But it also underlined that unchecked wickedness meets an end. Sodom's story is thus not only about sexual immorality or inhospitality, it's about a society whose every level was violently corrupt. Lot's presence in Sodom, and his flawed righteousness amid it, is a cautionary tale of living too close to evil. He escaped, but barely and with heavy losses. The Angels in a Wicked City episode shows the darkest side of human behaviour, contrasted with the steadfast justice and mercy of God. While God's patience is great, he would spare for 10, he rescued the few righteous. When a culture passes the point of no return, judgment can be swift and sure. Abraham's vantage point, seeing the rising smoke, impresses the reader with the finality of that judgment. It also perhaps reassured Abraham that the judge of all the earth had indeed done right. No innocent was swept away unjustly. This sobering event would be etched into the collective memory of Abraham's descendants as an example and warning. Yet through it, God preserved the line of Lot, from whom would come the Moabites and Ammonites via the unfortunate cave incident after Sodom's fall, showing that even in judgment new peoples arose, though they too would have troubled histories with Israel. In sum, the destruction of Sodom is one of the Bible's clearest lessons on divine holiness and human depravity, set against the backdrop of Abraham's covenant narrative, where grace and judgment are both present in God's dealings with humanity. When the smoke cleared, the once thriving cities of the plain were no more. The fertile valley that had attracted Lot now smouldered, a scar on the landscape by the Dead Sea. The immediate aftermath for Abraham was one of solemn observation. Early that morning, Abraham went to the spot where he had stood before the Lord and looked out towards Sodom and Gomorrah. What he saw was haunting, dense smoke rising from the land like the smoke of a furnace. Genesis 19:27-28. It must have been a devastating sight for Abraham. Though he had known judgment was coming, witnessing its extent is another matter. He likely thought of the people he had met when rescuing them from Chedorlaomer's armies, now gone. He thought of Lot and Lot's family, hoping against hope they had escaped. In that thick plume, Abraham saw a stark answer to his intercession. Not even 10 righteous were found, confirming the city's utter corruption. The Bible doesn't record Abraham's reaction beyond seeing the smoke, but we can imagine he was somber, perhaps grieving. This was the first instance of God executing such a catastrophic judgment since the flood, and Abraham had the vantage point much like Noah's family seeing the post-flood devastation. It underscored that the covenant promise of Canaan's land came with an expectation of righteousness. The Canaanites' own future would involve judgment for their sins when their measure was full, just as Sodom's had been. For Lot and his daughters, the aftermath was survival laced with trauma. They ended up abandoning even Zoar, the small refuge city spared at Lot's request, and retreating to the mountains, dwelling in a cave, 1930. Perhaps they feared that staying in any city was unsafe, or maybe Zoar's people resented them, or were themselves wicked. In that cave, a troubling incident occurred. Lot's daughters, thinking that the destruction had wiped out humanity, or at least their chance to marry and continue the family line, got their father drunk on successive nights, and each became pregnant by him, 1931 to 36. The Bible states this matter-of-factly without approving. It was incest born of desperation and flawed reasoning. The 2 sons born were Moab and Ben-Ami, progenitors of the Moabites and Ammonites, 1937 to 38. These nations would later be neighbours and often adversaries of Israel. Ironic fruit from Lot, Abraham's kin, who had chosen Sodom. The Moabites and Ammonites carried some of the legacy of Sodom indirectly, and they too would have complicated moral narratives in Scripture. But God, in his providence, even used that lineage. For example, the Moabite woman Ruth becomes an ancestress of King David, and thus Jesus, demonstrating grace can come out of dark situations. Meanwhile, Abraham's life moved on. He relocated southward to the Negev and sojourned in Gerar, Genesis 20, leading to another wife-sister episode with King Abimelech, showing Abraham was still flawed and human. But reflecting on Sodom, Abraham likely carried forward lessons. He had tangibly witnessed that the judge of all the earth indeed executes justice, and that his own role was to cultivate righteousness and justice in his household to avoid such an end. The term "after the destruction for Sodom" became proverbial. Future generations would reference Sodom and Gomorrah as the epitome of divine wrath on sin, a cautionary tale for Israel and others, Deuteronomy 29:23, Isaiah 3:9, Jude 1:7. The ruins, possibly visible or known, served as a grim monument. Some scholars and explorers believe the area at the southern Dead Sea has evidence of ancient cataclysmic destruction by fire, linking possibly to Babed Dra and Numeira archaeological sites, though identifying Sodom exactly remains debated. Regardless, the memory endured. For Abraham personally, Genesis notes that God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, 1929. This line confirms that it was specifically because of Abraham's intercession and favour with God that Lot was spared. Thus, even in judgment, God's mercy toward Abraham extended to his extended family. Abraham's story continues with new challenges, but Sodom's chapter closes with finality. In the tapestry of Abraham's life, the Sodom episode accentuates his role as intercessor and underscores the stark difference between living by faith, Abraham's tents of obedience, versus living in wickedness, Sodom's houses of depravity. Abraham saw that difference in ash and smoke. It likely deepened his commitment to raise Isaac, when he would have him, in the way of the Lord, doing righteousness and justice, so that the promise to bless all nations through him wouldn't be derailed by the kind of corruption that destroyed Sodom. In sum, the aftermath of Sodom's destruction left an indelible mark on Abraham's consciousness and on the collective moral imagination of his descendants, a symbol of how not to be, and a call to embody the justice and mercy that Abraham himself exhibited in prayer. Not long after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham journeyed to the Negev region and settled for a while in Gerar, Genesis 21. Gerar was a Philistine town. Though this is before the main Philistine influx in Canaan, the term is used retroactively, ruled by King Abimelech. Despite all of Abraham's experiences with God's faithfulness, an old fear resurfaced as he entered Gerar. Sarah, even at 90 years old, was apparently still an attractive woman, perhaps preserved by longevity, and also her newfound joy at the promised pregnancy. Abraham worried that the men of Gerar might kill him to take Sarah, just as he'd feared in Egypt decades earlier. And so, falling into a familiar pattern, Abraham told people that Sarah was his sister, Genesis 20 verse 2. This was technically a half-truth. Sarah was his half-sister, daughter of his father Terah by another mother, but it was a deceptive omission of her being his wife. Thus, history repeated itself. King Abimelech, hearing of this beautiful sister, took Sarah into his household. It's astonishing to see Abraham slip into the same error as before, especially after God explicitly promised that within a year Sarah would bear his son, Isaac. Perhaps Abraham thought protecting his life was paramount to see that promise fulfilled. Yet by not trusting God here, he again jeopardized Sarah's honor and the promise itself. However, God intervened even more directly and swiftly this time. One night God came to Abimelech in a dream and said, "Behold, you are a dead man because of the woman you have taken, for she is a man's wife." Genesis 23. Abimelech, who apparently had not approached Sarah intimately yet, responded in the dream pleading his innocence. He said, "Lord, will you slay an innocent people? Did he not himself say to me, 'She is my sister'? In the integrity of my heart and innocence of my hands, I have done this." Genesis 20, 4-5. God acknowledged Abimelech's integrity, saying he kept Abimelech from sinning, perhaps via circumstances that prevented consummation, and that's why he warned him. Then God instructed Abimelech to return Sarah to Abraham, noting that Abraham was a prophet who would pray for Abimelech so that he would live, 26-7. This is the first occurrence of the word prophet in the Bible applied to Abraham, interestingly in context of Abraham needing to intercede because of his own misrepresentation. Abimelech woke and urgently gathered his servants to share the alarming dream, and they were all afraid. 28. He summoned Abraham and confronted him. "What have you done to us? How have I sinned against you, that you brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done deeds to me that ought not to be done." 29. Abimelech's words carry moral weight. He, a pagan king, was lecturing God's prophet on ethical behaviour. Abraham offered a sheepish defence. "I thought, surely there is no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife." Genesis 20:11. He explained Sarah really was his half-sister, rationalising it as a self-preservation strategy he had adopted whenever travelling, 2012-13. Abraham's excuse highlights his ongoing growth curve. He still hadn't fully learned to trust God with his life in dangerous situations. Abimelech, whether out of fear of God or royal magnanimity, then gave Sarah back and bestowed on Abraham generous compensation: sheep, cattle, male and female servants, and the freedom to settle wherever he pleased in Abimelech's lands, 2014-15. He also gave Abraham 1,000 pieces of silver as a public vindication of Sarah's honour, 2016. In effect, Abimelech's restitution paralleled Pharaoh's earlier one, but with even more clear acknowledgement of wrongdoing, even though Abimelech was more innocent than Pharaoh because he was misled. Abraham, true to God's word, then prayed for Abimelech's household, which had been struck with a peculiar affliction. The Lord had closed all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, 2017-18. Likely, during the time Sarah was in Abimelech's palace, the women of Abimelech's household experienced infertility or miscarriages, a divine signal that something was amiss. Once Abraham prayed, God healed Abimelech, his wife, and female servants so they could bear children again, 2017. This highlights Abraham's role as intercessor once more. His prayer was the means for healing, demonstrating that despite his lapse, God still honoured him as prophet and channel of blessing. It must have been a humbling lesson for Abraham. He had nearly repeated a fatal mistake, but God's grace bailed him, and others, out again. Abimelech's rebuke also showed that the fear of God might exist in unexpected places. Contrary to Abraham's assumption, Abimelech did respond to God's warning with healthy fear and integrity. Perhaps Abraham realised that his prejudgment of Gerar was wrong and that he should have been more forthright. For readers, this Gerar incident reinforces that Abraham was not chosen for his perfection. Even late in his faith journey, he stumbled. Yet God's faithfulness remained steadfast, protecting Sarah and the covenant plan. It's also providential that this happened just before Isaac's conception, since by next chapter Sarah conceives. It removed any doubt about Isaac's paternity. By safeguarding Sarah's purity, no one could claim Isaac was Abimelech's child. In that sense, even Abraham's folly was woven into God's sovereign plan to underscore the miraculous nature of Isaac's birth. After this brush with disaster, Abraham settled in the land of the Philistines for a long time, 2134. We don't hear of further deceptions. Perhaps he finally learned to trust God fully with his safety. The Gerar episode, a déjà vu of Egypt, closes with God's mercy again triumphing over Abraham's fear, and with Abraham's honour oddly affirmed in the eyes of the surrounding nations, albeit through an embarrassing scenario. It serves as both a caution and a comfort. Even great people of faith have weaknesses, and God remains gracious, often using even their missteps to accomplish his purposes. The story of Abraham, Sarah and Abimelech in Gerar is essentially a lesson relearned in trusting God versus scheming out of fear. In many ways it mirrors the earlier episode in Egypt, almost like a divinely allowed repetition to refine Abraham's character and to protect the integrity of the promised offspring. In Gerar, Abraham fell back on an old survival tactic, passing off Sarah as his sister. This suggests that even after decades of walking with God, old habits and insecurities can die hard. Abraham's fear was not entirely baseless culturally. Powerful kings did sometimes seize attractive women for their harems, but given God's track record of protection, as in Egypt and in battle, Abraham's lapse shows his humanity. The fact that Sarah complied again also speaks to her position. She trusted Abraham's leadership, though this would be the last time such a ruse was attempted. God's intervention through a dream to Abimelech prevented any wrongdoing just in time. It's interesting that God calls Abraham a prophet in this scenario, Genesis 27, underscoring that Abraham's status before God isn't revoked even when he errs. This is encouraging. One's calling and gifts can still operate despite personal flaws, though not without consequences or the need for correction. Abimelech's respectful fear of God and immediate obedience stands in contrast to Abraham's fear of man in this moment. Thus, Abimelech unwittingly becomes a moral foil to Abraham. It's a bit shameful for the man of faith to be corrected by a Gentile king, yet that's what happened. You have done things to me that ought not to be done. 29. Abraham offered his rationale, fear for his life, plus technically she is my sister. But as excuses go, they ring hollow morally. Even he admitted, I thought surely there is no fear of God in this place. Ironically, there was fear of God in Abimelech's heart when confronted, whereas Abraham momentarily lacked it in his deception. So Abraham misjudged the situation due to prejudice or past traumas. Through Abimelech's restoration of Sarah and giving of gifts, we see a pagan king acting with more integrity than many would in that era. He sought to clear Sarah's reputation by a public gift, essentially compensating her and Abraham and vindicating her honour, 2016. This suggests Abimelech genuinely wanted to right any wrong and avoid divine wrath. The closing note of the chapter that Abraham prayed and God healed the wombs of Abimelech's house is rich in irony. The man whose own wife's womb was barren is praying for others' fertility, and God answers that prayer. It's a subtle hint that if Abraham can intercede to open others' wombs, surely God can and will open Sarah's at the appointed time, which indeed happens in the very next verses. So there's a symbolic prelude here. Right after Abraham's prayer heals a foreign household's barrenness, God visited Sarah and she conceived Isaac, Genesis 21 to 1 to 2. It's as if God waited for Abraham to take that step of intercessory prayer before fulfilling the long-awaited promise, perhaps to show Abraham the power of intercession and to increase his faith for Sarah's miracle. After Gerar, we hear no more of Abraham denying Sarah. By this point, Sarah is around 90, pregnant soon after, and perhaps less likely to be coveted, though clearly her appeal endured surprisingly long. But more importantly, Abraham seems to have finally learned that God truly is capable of preserving him and his wife through any threat. The next chapters show Abraham trusting God even with Isaac's life. Thus, the Gerar incident, embarrassing as it was, ended with a gracious outcome. Sarah's honour intact, Abraham enriched and taught, Abimelech warned and blessed, and the stage cleared of any ambiguity for Isaac's birth. This lesson relearned cemented Abraham's reliance on God's promise and foreshadowed the joy to come. It also provided the narrative asymmetry. Two nearly identical failures bracket Abraham's journey. Egypt early on, Gerar later, showing a consistent weakness, but also framing a growth. Between these incidents, Abraham's faith had soared in many ways. He left his home, believed God for a son, interceded for Sodom, etc. We're reminded that even giants of faith are fallible, and sometimes require multiple experiences to fully overcome a fear. But God remained patient and protective of his covenant plan. In the final analysis, Abraham's story with Abimelech served as a final purge of doubt before the promised child arrived, so that when Isaac was born there would be no shadow of human scheming involved, only laughter at God's miraculous grace. At long last, the pivotal moment in Abraham and Sarah's life arrived. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. Genesis 21:1. After 25 years of waiting in Canaan, Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the precise time of which God had spoken. Abraham, now 100 years old, and Sarah 90, welcomed their miracle baby, the child of promise. Abraham named his newborn son Isaac, Yitzhak in Hebrew, which means he laughs, 21:3, just as God had instructed earlier. This name encapsulated the joyous irony of their situation. Both Abraham and Sarah had laughed at the prospect of bearing a child in their extreme age. Abraham's laughter of amazement, Genesis 17:17, and Sarah's of incredulity, Genesis 18:12. Now those skeptical laughs were transformed into laughter of pure joy. God has made laughter for me, Sarah proclaimed. Everyone who hears will laugh over me, Genesis 21:6. Indeed, the once barren woman could hardly believe the delight. Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age, 21:7. There's a tone of playful astonishment in her words. At 90, she was nursing a baby. It was a scene that would cause anyone to smile or chuckle in wonder. Isaac's birth is not just the fulfillment of Abraham and Sarah's personal longing, but a key fulfillment of God's covenant promise to establish a line through Abraham. Abraham dutifully circumcised Isaac on the 8th day, as commanded, 21:4, thus initiating Isaac into the covenant sign from the start. One imagines the whole camp of Abraham celebrating this birth. For decades, Abraham had been known as exalted father, Abram, and then father of multitudes, Abraham, without a single child by Sarah. It might even have been a point of mockery or pity among servants or neighbours. Now finally the patriarch and matriarch held their own child. The rejoicing would have been great, feasting, singing, and, as Sarah highlighted, laughter. Isaac, the embodiment of promised grace growing up in their tent, must have brought immeasurable vitality to the aging couple. Sarah, who once bitterly cast blame on Abraham and Hagar out of infertility-fueled anguish, was now content and fulfilled, her status fully vindicated in the family and community. Her remark that everyone who hears will laugh with me can also imply that people would share in her joy, or that they'd be astonished. Both came true. Through Isaac's miraculous birth, God's power and faithfulness were broadcast to all around. No doubt Abimelech's court, who recently were entangled with Abraham's story, heard that the aged couple they nearly wronged now had a son as God had foretold. It served as a public testimony that nothing is too hard for the Lord. Isaac's upbringing began under the loving eyes of parents who had learned much about trusting God. Abraham and Sarah's faith journeys, with all their ups and downs, would certainly colour how they raised Isaac, likely with deep gratitude and awareness of his special role. Isaac symbolised not only personal joy, but the next chapter in God's redemptive plan. The name Laughter also suggests that Isaac's life brought lightness and hope. He was a tangible proof of God's tendency to turn sorrow to joy, impossibility to reality. The laughter of unbelief was silenced by the cries of a healthy newborn. In a theological sense, Isaac's birth can be seen as a foreshadow of other miraculous births, like that of Samuel to Hannah, or John to Elizabeth, or ultimately Jesus to Mary. Each in their way produced astonishment and joy because of God's direct intervention to bring life out of barrenness or impossibility. For Abraham and Sarah, every giggle from baby Isaac was a reminder of God's promise kept. The long wait made the fulfillment all the sweeter. Abraham's camp, once defined by expectancy and sometimes tension, was now filled with the sounds of a growing child, a foretaste of the multitudes to come from Abraham's line. Isaac, the first of Abraham's legitimate heirs, marked the dawn of a new era for the patriarch, the era of the promised son through whom nations and kings would eventually come. Abraham's story thus transitions from the quest for an heir to the challenges of parenting and legacy, with Isaac at the centre of God's unfolding covenant, joy and jealousy. As Isaac grew, the household dynamic shifted, bringing both great joy and renewed tensions. Genesis 21:8 notes that Isaac grew and was weaned, and on that occasion Abraham held a great feast. In ancient cultures, weaning, often at around 2 to 3 years old, was a significant milestone, as the child had survived infancy and could now eat solid food, becoming a more independent member of the family. The weaning celebration was Abraham's public display of delight in his young son Isaac. The child of promise was thriving, and everyone in the camp would join in the festivities. One can picture a jubilant Abraham perhaps making speeches of gratitude to God as roasted meat and bread were shared among the servants and guests. Sarah too would be proudly watching little Isaac toddle around, no doubt the centre of everyone's attention. For years, Ishmael, Abraham's son by Hagar, had been effectively the heir presumptive and the focus of paternal pride. But now Isaac took centre stage, which stirred up jealousy in the family circle. Ishmael was about 16 or 17 at this time, having been circumcised at 13 shortly before Isaac's birth. During the feast, Sarah noticed Ishmael doing something troubling. The Hebrew text says Ishmael was laughing or mocking, 21:9, perhaps mocking Isaac. The wordplay is striking. Ishmael was laughing, or a metzachek at Yitzchak, Isaac, which means laughter. Possibly Ishmael, a teenager, was teasing or taunting the toddler, maybe out of envy that this little half-brother was displacing him. Some Jewish commentators suggest he might have been bullying Isaac, or even engaging in more disturbing behaviour, but at minimum it was disrespectful and born of rivalry. Sarah reacted fiercely. She was extremely protective of Isaac's status as Abraham's true heir. The sight of Ishmael mocking Isaac ignited her long-standing resentment toward Hagar's son, who, after all, symbolised the earlier attempt to fulfill God's promise through human effort. Sarah confronted Abraham and demanded, "Cast out this slave woman and her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac." Genesis 21:10. This might sound harsh, but it had deep roots in Sarah's feelings and in the inheritance customs of the time. Legally, Ishmael as a firstborn, even via a concubine, might have had some claim. Sarah wanted to eliminate any challenge to Isaac's primacy. To her, Ishmael's behaviour forecast future conflict. Her phrase, "this slave woman," shows her disdain for Hagar, perhaps rekindled by seeing Ishmael act in a way that threatened Isaac's honour or safety. It's also a fulfilment of sorts of what the angel told Hagar about Ishmael being a wild donkey of a man, at odds with his kin. Genesis 16:12. Already, strife between Ishmael and Isaac was evident. Abraham was deeply distressed at Sarah's demand, 21:11. Ishmael was his son too, and Abraham loved him. Sending Ishmael away would break paternal bonds and essentially disinherit him. It likely tore at Abraham's heart. Recall he had asked God to bless Ishmael and let him live before God, 17:18, and God did promise to bless Ishmael, 17:20. Now Abraham faced a family crisis. Keeping peace under his roof seemed impossible if both sons stayed together. God intervened to guide Abraham. God told Abraham not to be displeased because of the boy and Hagar, and to heed Sarah's voice. "For through Isaac shall your offspring be named," 21:12. God affirmed Isaac's unique covenant status, but also reassured Abraham that Ishmael would not be forsaken. "I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring," 21:13. This divine guidance calmed Abraham's fears and clarified that the painful step of sending Ishmael away was within God's providence and plan. Essentially, God was saying, "Trust me with Ishmael's future. Isaac is the chosen line, but Ishmael will also be cared for under my promises." After all, Ishmael carries Abraham's blood and a measure of Abraham's blessing. So, early the next morning, Abraham reluctantly but obediently prepared provisions, bread and a skin of water, and gave them to Hagar, placing them on her shoulder, and sent her and Ishmael away. 21:14. It was a heart-rending goodbye. Hagar and Ishmael wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. The water eventually ran out, and in a poignant scene, Hagar, fearing her son would die of thirst, put Ishmael under a shrub and sat at distance weeping, unwilling to watch him perish. 21:15-16. But God heard the cry of Ishmael. His name means God hears, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven, comforting her. "Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy. I will make him into a great nation." Genesis 21:17-18. The God then opened Hagar's eyes to see a well of water nearby, saving them, 21:19. Ishmael grew up in the wilderness, became an expert archer, and Hagar got him a wife from Egypt, 21:21. True to his word, God had plans for Ishmael. He would father 12 princes, 25:16, and become the ancestor of a large nomadic people. Meanwhile, back at Abraham's camp, the turmoil subsided with Hagar and Ishmael's departure. Isaac's position as sole heir was secured, eliminating the immediate source of tension. Yet one can imagine Abraham's mixed emotions. Relief for Isaac's safety, perhaps, but sadness for Ishmael's absence. The joy and jealousy episode thus resolved, but not without cost. It highlights the complexity of blending God's promises with human attempts. Ishmael, the product of human impatience, had to be separated from Isaac, the child of promise, to ensure the covenant line remained pure and clearly miraculous. Galatians 4:28-31 later uses this story as an allegory, Isaac representing children of promise born by God's power, and Ishmael representing children of the flesh, born by human effort, concluding similarly that the slave woman's son could not share in the inheritance with the free woman's son. But on the human level, it's also a story of family love and strife, Abraham's affection divided, Sarah's maternal protectiveness, Hagar's despair and hope, Ishmael's adolescent angst. Through it all, God's faithfulness encompassed both branches. He safeguarded Isaac's destiny, and he did not abandon Ishmael. The event likely taught Abraham more about trusting God's promises completely, the drama with Hagar and Ishmael being the residue of earlier lack of trust, and about the painful consequences when trying to help God's plan along. For Isaac, though too young to remember, this meant he grew up as the undisputed son, deeply cherished by both parents, which would shape his gentle character seen later. The household, pruned of rivalry, could now focus on the joyful raising of the promised son, while Abraham continued to pray for and intermittently hear news of Ishmael's own growing family in the wilderness. The expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael is one of the most heart-rending episodes in Abraham's family life, and it was precipitated by a convergence of household tensions and divine direction. After Isaac's weaning feast when Sarah saw Ishmael mocking Isaac, Genesis 21-9, Sarah's protective instincts and perhaps long-harboured resentments flared. She essentially issued an ultimatum to Abraham: get rid of that slave woman and her son. To Sarah, Ishmael represented a threat to Isaac's inheritance and well-being. Perhaps she feared Ishmael, being older, might bully Isaac, or later contest his rights. In ancient law, the son of a slave woman could be considered the property of the master, but if recognised, he might also claim a share. Sarah wanted no ambiguity. Isaac was the sole heir of the covenant. Abraham found himself in a severe emotional dilemma. On one side, his beloved wife insisting on this course. On the other, his paternal love for Ishmael. Abraham was very distressed, 21:11, at the thought of sending his firstborn son away into an uncertain fate. It's important to recall that Abraham had pleaded with God on Ishmael's behalf years before, saying, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you," 17:18. Abraham had invested 13+ years in raising Ishmael, teaching him presumably about God, training him as his heir apparent until Isaac's arrival. To cast out Ishmael was like tearing away a piece of his own heart. Yet God spoke to Abraham, telling him not to be so grievous over the boy and Hagar, and to listen to Sarah's voice in this matter, 21:12. This divine instruction is significant. God essentially endorsed Sarah's intuition about the future of the family. God clarified, "For through Isaac shall your offspring be named," 21:12, affirming that the covenant line and identity would be traced exclusively through Isaac. But God, gracious as always, also reassured Abraham about Ishmael. "And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring," 21:13. So God promised to take care of Ishmael's destiny and multiply him too. This would have comforted Abraham somewhat, making the hard choice slightly more bearable, knowing that Ishmael, though leaving, carried a divine promise of his own. Thus, early the next morning Abraham acted. Rising early might indicate he wanted to carry out the painful task swiftly, perhaps to avoid prolonged agony or second-guessing. He prepared bread and a skin of water, simple provisions for a journey, placed them on Hagar's shoulder, and sent her away with Ishmael, 21:14. One imagines that farewell, tears, lingering hugs, perhaps words of blessing from Abraham to Ishmael, and apology to Hagar. The text is sparse, but the emotional weight is palpable. Abraham likely watched as Hagar and the boy walked off into the wilderness until they faded from sight. Sarah's reaction isn't recorded. Perhaps she felt relief and vindication, or maybe a tinge of empathy. After all, decades prior she had forced Hagar to flee, but Hagar returned. Now she was gone for good. Hagar and Ishmael wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba, which borders the Negev desert. Eventually the water Abraham gave ran out. Under the brutal sun, mother and child became dehydrated. Fearing Ishmael would die of thirst, Hagar placed the weak boy under the shade of a shrub and moved a bowshot away, saying, "Let me not look on the death of the child." Genesis 21:16. She lifted her voice and wept bitterly. This scene is gut-wrenching. Hagar, once a proud, if somewhat haughty, mother in Abraham's camp, now reduced to despairing castaway, believing she would witness her teenager's last breaths. Ishmael, called the lad, or boy in the text, likely weakened to the point of insensibility, also cried out silently to the God his father had taught him about. And indeed, God heard the voice of the boy, 21:17. Fittingly, since Ishmael's name means God hears, the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven, "What troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is." The angel repeated the earlier promise, "I will make him into a great nation," 21:18. Then God opened Hagar's eyes, perhaps a miraculous moment of perception, and she saw a well of water, 21:19. They refilled the skin and drank, reviving their strength. That well became their lifeline in the desert. This divine intervention parallels Hagar's first wilderness encounter with the angel of the Lord in Genesis 16, but with differences. The first time, a pregnant Hagar ran away due to strife with Sarah, and God sent her back with comfort. This time, Hagar was forcibly expelled, and God established that Ishmael's path lay separate from Isaac's. However, God still cared intimately for Hagar and Ishmael, proving his compassion for the marginalized, a theme throughout Scripture. The hard choice Abraham made, to obey God and let Ishmael go, was validated by God's providential care for Ishmael. God essentially said to Abraham, "Let him go, trust me with him." And indeed, God took over Ishmael's guardianship. Hagar's banishment ultimately led to Ishmael forging his own path. Genesis 21:20-21 summaries that God was with Ishmael as he grew up. He became an expert archer, living in the Paran wilderness between Canaan and Egypt's Sinai area. Hagar got him a wife from Egypt, her homeland, thus connecting Ishmael to her people. Ishmael would have 12 sons, Genesis 25:13-16, princes who became progenitors of the Arab tribes around the region, fulfilling God's promise of multiplying him into a nation. So, while Ishmael's story diverges here from the main biblical narrative centered on Isaac, the Bible notes his flourishing. This shows that Isaac's election did not mean Ishmael's utter rejection in a general sense. Ishmael too had a role and a blessing, albeit outside the covenant of promise which would continue through Isaac to Israel. For Abraham, letting go of Ishmael was likely one of the greatest tests of his faith and obedience, perhaps second only to the upcoming test with Isaac on Mount Moriah. It required him to surrender his natural attachment and trust God's promise over his paternal instinct. It separated the works of the flesh, Ishmael, product of human effort, from the child of promise, Isaac, product of divine miracle, a necessary separation for God's plan to unfold without confusion. The immediate pain gave way to long-term peace in the family dynamic, and possibly a greater focus on Isaac's upbringing. Abraham likely never saw Ishmael again, though he would later learn of Ishmael's 12 sons, and importantly, Ishmael and Isaac would reunite briefly to bury their father Abraham, Genesis 25-9, indicating that the estranged half-brothers had some level of reconciliation, or at least cooperation at the end of Abraham's life. In conclusion, Hagar's banishment was a hard choice that God required for the sake of his covenant purposes, but it was tempered by God's grace toward those sent away. It underscores a theme. Sometimes following God's promise involves painful separations, but God's care extends to all parties in ways we may not foresee. Abraham's household couldn't peacefully contain both heirs, so God, like a wise gardener, transplanted one so both might thrive according to his design. Isaac would grow in a home without rivalry, and Ishmael would grow under God's hand in freedom. The narrative is honest about the human sorrow involved, but it also highlights divine faithfulness to Isaac the chosen and to Ishmael the also loved. It's a nuanced demonstration of how God's election works, narrowing the covenant line while still providing for those not chosen for that specific role. In the end, both sons of Abraham had destinies, and Abraham had to entrust Ishmael's destiny to God completely. After the family turmoil of sending Hagar and Ishmael away, Abraham's life in Canaan continued, and one notable event was the establishment of a peaceful covenant with the local Philistine king, Abimelech, at a place that became known as Beersheba. Sometime after Isaac's birth, Genesis 21:22, perhaps when Isaac was a young child, Abimelech, the same king who had taken Sarah into his harem unwittingly, visited Abraham, accompanied by Phicol, the commander of his army. Abimelech had observed that Abraham was blessed in all that he did. 21:22. Abraham's household had grown wealthy and influential. God's favour was evident. Possibly Abimelech noticed Abraham's God intervening, as in the dream and healing of his household, and thus respected Abraham. Now, wanting a stable relationship, Abimelech said, "God is with you in all that you do. Now therefore swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me or my offspring, but as I have dealt kindly with you, so you will deal with me and with the land." 21:22-23. Essentially, Abimelech sought a non-aggression pact and a guarantee of fair treatment. He remembered the earlier incident where Abraham's half-truth nearly brought disaster, so he specifically asked for honesty and kindness moving forward. Abraham agreed to swear, 21:24, sealing a mutual oath of friendship and truthfulness. This shows Abimelech's prudent recognition that having a man like Abraham as an ally was wise, and Abraham, for his part, likely welcomed peaceful relations with neighbours. However, before finalising the covenant, Abraham brought up a grievance about a well. Abraham reproved Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized. 21:25. In the arid Negev region, water wells were precious property, often leading to disputes. Apparently Abraham had dug or owned a well, and Abimelech's people had forcefully taken it over. Abimelech professed ignorance, saying he hadn't heard of it until that day, 21:26. So to settle the matter, Abraham took action. He gave Abimelech sheep and oxen, and they made a covenant, 21:27. Abraham also set apart 7 ewe lambs by themselves. Abimelech asked about that gesture, and Abraham explained that Abimelech should accept the 7 lambs as a testimony that Abraham had dug that well, 21:28-30. By accepting them, Abimelech was effectively acknowledging Abraham's rights to the well. The number 7 in Hebrew, Sheva, is a wordplay with Beersheba. It can mean 7 or oath. Thus, the well and the place were named Beersheba, meaning well of the oath, or well of 7 because of the oath sworn and the 7 lambs given, 21:31. This formalised their agreement. Abraham kept rightful ownership of the water source, and both parties vowed honesty and goodwill. After the covenant, Abimelech and Phicol returned to Philistine territory, 21:32. Abraham then planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, 21:33. Planting a tree likely signified Abraham's intent to stay long-term in that region, and a thanksgiving memorial. Under its shade he called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. This is significant. Abraham uses a new title for God, El Olam, everlasting God, emphasizing God's eternal, unchanging nature. Perhaps after seeing how transient human conflicts and pacts can be, Abraham worshipped the God who endures beyond all generations. The successful treaty and well secured gave Abraham a sense of peace and stability, allowing him to focus on worship and his family. He recognized that God had not only provided miraculously a son, but also provided water and peaceful relations, evidence of God's promise to bless him and make him a blessing to neighbours. Thus, Beersheba became an important location. It marked the southern extent of the promised land often noted later. From Dan to Beersheba became a saying for the whole land of Israel. Abraham sojourned many days in Philistine land, 21:34, presumably around Beersheba, content that he could coexist with his neighbours without quarrel, now that clear boundaries and agreements were set. The oath at Beersheba was a moment of Abraham being a peacemaker and wise negotiator, as well as a witness to Abimelech about the righteousness of his God. The well dispute also reflects how Abraham, though a foreigner, stood up for his rights fairly, and God granted him favour in the eyes of the local ruler to get justice. Interestingly, Abimelech, who earlier rebuked Abraham for deception, now sees Abraham's integrity in action, and they reach mutual trust. This second encounter with Abimelech shows how Abraham's relations with the world around him had improved. His earlier failing was behind him and replaced by transparency and fairness. The treaty also benefited Abimelech, ensuring Abraham's powerful clan, with growing wealth and the backing of God, wouldn't pose a threat. It was essentially a non-aggression and cooperation pact. In later tradition, Beersheba would remain significant. Isaac and Jacob would both have associations with it. But for now, Abraham had a secure foothold, a precious water source, and a solemn friendship with the local powers. After wandering through various places, Shechem, Bethel, Hebron, etc., Abraham now had a semi-permanent home base at Beersheba, where he could freely worship the everlasting God. This peaceful interlude set the stage for the next big test of his faith. But at this juncture, the narrative emphasizes stability and prosperity under God's blessing. The well of oath at Beersheba symbolized that God was establishing Abraham in the land, bit by bit, fulfilling promises in tangible ways. Each oath, each altar, each grove of trees planted marked Abraham's gradual claiming of God's promises in faith. In this way, Abraham's story was not just one of wandering, but of forming meaningful relationships and legacies in the very land his descendants would inherit. Beersheba thus stands as a testament to harmonious coexistence, divine provision, and Abraham's evolving witness among the nations. Perhaps the most dramatic and theologically significant event in Abraham's life is the binding of Isaac, known in Hebrew as the Akedah. Sometime after the covenant at Beersheba, God called out to Abraham and in a stunning directive said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will show you." Genesis 22.2. This command is breathtaking in its gravity. Isaac was the son of promise, the miracle child born to Abraham and Sarah in their old age, and God explicitly acknowledges the depth of Abraham's love for him, stressing, "Your son, your only son, whom you love." The use of only son is notable, even though Ishmael was also Abraham's son, because Isaac is the unique son of covenant promise. Now God was asking Abraham to relinquish Isaac in the most absolute way possible, through sacrifice. The test here was extreme, ethically, emotionally, and spiritually. Child sacrifice was practiced by some Canaanite cults to gods like Molech, but the God of Abraham had never before, nor after, sanctioned such a thing. This was an unprecedented request, one that seemingly contradicted God's earlier promise that Isaac would carry on the covenant and produce many descendants. How could that happen if Isaac was slain? The text presents it as a test, 22-1, and Abraham doesn't question God in the narrative as we have it. Early the next morning, Abraham acted decisively. He saddled his donkey, took 2 young servants and Isaac, split wood for the burnt offering, and set out toward Mount Moriah, 22:3. The journey took 3 days, 22.4. One can only imagine what went through Abraham's mind during that journey, likely turmoil and prayer. Hebrews 11:19 later insightfully suggests that Abraham reasoned that God could raise Isaac from the dead if necessary, indicating that Abraham clung to faith in God's promise, even as he prepared to obey this perplexing command. On the 3rd day, Abraham saw the mountain from afar. He instructed his servants, "Stay here. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." 22:5. Notably, he tells them, "We will come again," perhaps a statement of faith, or possibly to avoid alarming them. Abraham laid the wood on Isaac's shoulders, while he himself carried the fire, likely in a pot of coals, and the knife, Genesis 22:6. As they ascended the mount alone, Isaac spoke up innocently, "My father, behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" 22.7. That question must have cut to Abraham's heart. Abraham replied with prophetic ambiguity, "God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." Genesis 22:8. Was this a statement of trust that God would substitute something? Or was he gently telling Isaac that God's provision was in what they were about to do, with Isaac as the offering? Either way, Isaac apparently accepted the answer, and they walked on together. One senses the deep trust Isaac had in his father. He doesn't seem to suspect what's coming, implying that Abraham hadn't told him explicitly the plan. When they reached the place God indicated, a specific spot on Mount Moriah, Abraham built an altar, arranged the wood, and then with a heavy heart he bound Isaac and laid him on the wood. Genesis 22:9. Isaac by now likely realized what was happening. The text is silent on Isaac's reaction, but his lack of recorded resistance suggests a remarkable willingness. Isaac could have been a teenager strong enough to fight or flee, yet he allowed himself to be bound. Perhaps Isaac shared his father's faith or was in too much shock to resist. Abraham then took the knife and reached out his hand to slay his son. Genesis 22:10. It's an image both horrifying and profoundly moving. Abraham's love for God put above everything, even the son he loved more than life itself. At that critical moment, the voice of the angel of the Lord called out from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham," he answered, "Here I am." The angel said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Genesis 22:11-12. Relief must have flooded Abraham's soul. He had proven his fear of God, meaning reverence and obedience to God's will, to the ultimate degree. Notably, God never intended for Isaac to be actually killed. It was a test to manifest Abraham's trust and obedience. And indeed, Abraham had passed. He had not withheld his beloved son from God. Then Abraham noticed behind him a ram caught by its horns in a thicket. Genesis 22:13. He quickly went and took the ram and offered it as the burnt offering instead of his son. This substitutionary sacrifice provided by God becomes a rich symbol through the rest of Jewish and Christian thought, God himself providing the lamb. Abraham named that place Jehovah-Jireh, or the Lord will provide, 22:14, to commemorate that God had provided the sacrifice. It said, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided," or shall be seen, hinting at God's provision in dire circumstances. Indeed, many see this as a foreshadow of God providing his own son as a sacrifice in the region of Moriah, which later is associated with Jerusalem's Temple Mount, a profound typology noted by Christian interpreters. After the sacrifice, the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven with a powerful affirmation from God. "By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand on the seashore. Your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." Genesis 22:16-18. This is like the covenant promises given earlier but now confirmed with an oath from God, a rare and emphatic guarantee. It underlines that Abraham's obedience has fully unlocked the covenant's richest blessings. The language expands, dust, stars, and now sand on the seashore as analogies for countless progeny, victory over enemies, and the global blessing reiterated. This event thus seals the Abrahamic covenant in an unbreakable way, God swearing by himself. Abraham and Isaac then returned to the servants and went back to Beersheba, 22:19. One imagines Isaac's demeanour, likely sobered and awed, yet also perhaps honoured in some way. The father-son relationship surely reached a depth beyond words after this near sacrifice. Abraham had shown Isaac that he put God first, and Isaac learned what true surrender and deliverance look like. Isaac himself was essentially brought from death. Hebrews 11:19 says Abraham did receive Isaac back as a symbol, or in a figure, of resurrection, since in Abraham's mind Isaac was as good as dead for those moments before God intervened. This cemented Isaac's own faith foundation, we can surmise, though the story focuses on Abraham's ordeal. Jewish tradition holds that Isaac was an adult, even up to 37, which emphasizes his willing participation. Some Christian traditions see in Isaac a type of Christ carrying the wood, cross, and submitting to the Father's will. The ultimate test on Moriah became Abraham's ultimate legacy of faith. It demonstrated absolute trust that God himself will provide the lamb, a line pregnant with prophetic meaning. It also illustrated that God does not desire literal human sacrifice. In fact, he provided a substitute. It was a once-for-all test that God put his friend Abraham through. Not for God's knowledge, he knows all, but to manifest Abraham's faith to himself, to Isaac, and to the watching world, and perhaps heavenly realms. James 2:21-23 later, cites this event to show that Abraham's faith was proven genuine by his works, and that he was called friend of God. Indeed, through this, Abraham's earlier belief credited as righteousness, and his obedient act converged. He held nothing back from God. In God's plan, no more such test of human sacrifice would be asked. To the contrary, Mosaic law later forbids it, and the prophets decry it. This singular event stands as a pinnacle of devotion. For Abraham, after Moriah, there was basically no greater demonstration of fearing God left. The rest of his life, it seems, God did not test him in such ways again. The next chapter deals with Sarah's death and burial, comparatively normal affairs, so Moriah was like the crescendo of Abraham's spiritual journey. The Mount of Testing became the Mount of Provision and Promise. It is revered in all Abrahamic religions as a site of utmost faith and divine mercy. The story resonates deeply with themes of sacrifice, substitution, and God's ultimate provision for redemption, culminating, in Christian understanding, on another hill in the same vicinity 2,000 years later, where God did not spare his own son but offered him for the world. Truly, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. Abraham's ultimate test thus not only affirmed the covenant, but cast a long shadow of hope and expectation for God's ultimate lamb, faith and obedience on Mount Moriah. The episode of Abraham nearly sacrificing Isaac on Mount Moriah is often regarded as the supreme illustration of faith in action and obedience under trial. Abraham's journey of faith had many milestones, but this one eclipsed them all in difficulty. It's worth reflecting on how the narrative showcases Abraham's demeanour and decision-making as he approached this command. When God calls, Abraham, this time, Genesis 22:1, Abraham responds, "Here I am," the same ready reply he gave in earlier dialogues and will give to the angel and to Isaac during this event. It shows his attentiveness to God's voice. Upon hearing the unthinkable instruction to sacrifice Isaac, the text is silent on Abraham's immediate feelings. We're left to imagine a storm of emotions: horror, confusion, heartbreak. Yet the very next verse says he rose early to go obey. Abraham did not delay or attempt to negotiate as he had for Sodom or earlier pleaded for Ishmael. Perhaps he discerned this was a direct command to be obeyed, not discussed. Or maybe he was in stunned submission. Hebrews 11:17-19 pulls back the curtain. Abraham acted by faith, considering that God was able to raise people even from the dead. This New Testament insight reveals Abraham's thought process. God had promised descendants through Isaac, so if God now asked for Isaac's life, then logically God must intend to bring Isaac back to fulfill the promise. That's an extraordinary level of trust, to obey something that seems to negate God's promise, trusting that somehow God will still honour his word. It's faith in God's character, that God cannot lie and is righteous, taken to its extreme conclusion. On the journey, Abraham kept the purpose vague, telling servants, "We will worship and return." This could be either to keep them from hindering him or an expression of hope. As father and son ascended Moriah, the narrative slows down with Isaac's question and Abraham's poignant answer: God will provide himself the lamb. This statement is a linchpin of the story. On one hand, it was a way to satisfy Isaac's curiosity without revealing the plan. On the other, it was Abraham vocalizing his trust that God would indeed see to the essential need. The Hebrew can imply, God will provide for himself the lamb, which adds a layer. God will ensure the offering that will satisfy his requirement, possibly hinting that the act was more about God's provision than human offering. Abraham's naming of the place afterward as "the Lord will provide" cements this as the lesson he gleaned. The binding, hence akadar, binding in Hebrew, is described with a few words but conveys totality. He bound Isaac and placed him on the altar atop the wood. Binding likely was done to prevent reflexive struggle and to ensure a swift, merciful execution. Imagine Abraham's hands, the same hands that lovingly guided and protected Isaac, now tying him up for slaughter. And Isaac, perhaps tearful but trusting. There's no record of him fighting back or screaming, though any such details might be omitted for reverence in the text. Traditional commentary often praises Isaac's willingness, making him a cooperator in this extreme act of obedience, even calling him a willing sacrifice in his own right. Some midrashim consider his age and willingness as making him almost as meritorious as Abraham. When Abraham took the knife, every reader holds their breath. It's at this penultimate moment the angel's cry comes urgently. Abraham! Abraham! The double name calling shows urgency and emphasis. It had to be stopped immediately. Abraham again replies, "Here I am," as if fully ready to receive whatever further instruction, or perhaps expecting God's intervention at the last moment as he'd hoped. The angel's words, "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Now I know that you fear God," affirm that this was an examination of Abraham's reverence and surrender. "Now I know" is phrased in a human way. Of course, God foreknew Abraham's heart, but actual obedience manifested it in reality. It demonstrated to any onlookers, maybe the angelic host, maybe to Isaac, maybe to readers of Scripture, the extent of Abraham's fear of God. Fear of God in Scripture often means reverent obedience, acknowledging God's ultimate authority above all else. Abraham's willingness to give up even the promised child epitomized this reverence. The substitution of the ram is crucial. God indeed provided a sacrifice. The ram wasn't there by accident. It's portrayed as a divine provision caught just then. Abraham offering it instead of his son, 22:13, introduces the concept of substitutionary sacrifice clearly. Isaac's life is spared by another taking his place. For believers in later times, this speaks volumes about God's way of redemption, an innocent substitute provided by God to save the beloved human, just as Christ is later seen as the Lamb of God provided to save humanity. On the spot, Abraham's relief must have been overwhelming. One can imagine him untie Isaac, both maybe weeping and embracing in joy and worship, while that ram was put on the altar and burnt, its smoke rising as a sweet aroma of both sacrifice and thanksgiving. Naming the place Yahweh Yireh, the Lord will provide, declared the essence of Abraham's takeaway. The narrator adds that even to this day, likely meaning the time Genesis was written or compiled, people use the proverb, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided," seen, 22:14. That suggests the story was already circulating and the site possibly revered. Mount Moriah is later associated with the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. 2 Chronicles 3:1 places Solomon's temple on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem, making this story foundational for the sanctity of that location as a place where God's provision was dramatically experienced. The second angelic voice, 22:15-18, is basically God's covenant reaffirmed with oath. It's as if God said, "You've demonstrated ultimate allegiance, so I officially guarantee the ultimate blessings I promised." The structure, "by myself I have sworn," is unique. Since God cannot swear by any higher, he swears by himself, making this an unconditional ironclad promise. The reward is not something fundamentally new. It reiterates numerous offspring, conquering enemies, universal blessing. But the oath and the mention, "because you have obeyed my voice," tie the covenant fulfillment to Abraham's faithful obedience. This in no way undermines that the promise was grace-based. Isaac was given by miracle. But it shows the concept that blessings are often realized through obedience. Abraham's faith, shown through action, was the channel through which the full promise would flow. Thus, Abraham's part in the covenant, his trust and obedience, and God's part, his grace and promise, beautifully converged. For Isaac, witness to his father's absolute devotion, this event must have left an indelible impression of what it means to fear God. He saw firsthand that nothing, not even his beloved life, was above God. He also experienced God's deliverance personally. This likely forged Isaac's own relationship with God deeply. Though Isaac's own life later seemed quieter, he perhaps internalized this moment profoundly. Jewish tradition even reckons Isaac as being sanctified by this event, calling him an Ola Tamima, a perfect burnt offering, in intention, such that his merits and that of Abraham at Moriah became a cornerstone of Jewish appeals to God's mercy thereafter, i.e., remember Abraham's binding of Isaac as a theme in Jewish prayers. In summary, the test on Moriah stands as the ultimate example of faith-empowered obedience. It showcases that Abraham truly held nothing back from God, and in response, God confirmed he'd hold nothing back in blessing him. It's a story of fear, trust, heartbreak, relief, and worship, all intertwined on a lonely mountain altar. It also lays a theological foundation, the idea that God may test his servants not to make them fail, but to refine and prove their faith, and that God himself will provide what is needed for his purposes, including the means of atonement. Abraham and Isaac's journey up and then down Moriah, thus became one of the most cherished narratives of what trusting and obeying God looks like. With resonances that echo throughout scripture and faith traditions, truly an apex of faith and obedience in religious memory. After such a mountain-top encounter, Abraham descended knowing more intimately than ever that God was truly Jehovah Jireh, the provider who saw his need and met it, and who thus could be trusted utterly even in the darkest command. It was the crowning jewel in Abraham's spiritual crown, one that identified him forever as the father of those who have faith to the point of total surrender. After the intense drama of Mount Moriah, Abraham's story moves into a quieter, though poignant chapter, the death of Sarah, his beloved wife and partner in faith. Sarah is the only woman in the Bible whose age at death is recorded, highlighting her importance. She lived to be 127 years old. Genesis 23:1. That means Isaac was around 37 at her passing, since she was 90 at his birth. The text says, Sarah died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. 23:2. Hebron, specifically the area of Mamre, had been home to Abraham and Sarah for many years. They dwelt there before moving to Gerar and Beersheba. Thus, Sarah's death occurred in a region familiar and dear to them. When she died, Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Genesis 23:2. This is a tender note. Abraham, a man who had faced kings and armies and even God's testing, now let tears flow for the loss of his life's companion. Their marriage had weathered many trials, infertility, travels, even 2 incidents of near loss of Sarah to foreign kings. Sarah had laughed with disbelief and then with joy at God's promise. She had given Abraham counsel, sometimes flawed as with Hagar, and support. Her death truly marked the end of an era for Abraham. Beyond the personal grief, Sarah's death raised a practical issue: where to bury her. Abraham, though very wealthy and favoured in the land, owned no land outright in Canaan yet. The promises of land were still future. He was technically a sojourner. Now he needed a burial site. The narrative of Genesis 23 details how Abraham acquired a piece of land as a burial possession, and it's the first real estate the patriarchs own in Canaan, a small down payment, so to speak, on God's promise of the whole land. Abraham rose from mourning and went to the Hittites, or sons of Heth, who controlled Hebron at their city gate, which was the customary place for legal transactions. He respectfully said, I am a stranger and a sojourner among you. Give me property among you for a burying place. 23:4. The Hittites responded graciously, calling Abraham a prince of God among us. 23:6. And offered him the choicest of their tombs, even saying they wouldn't withhold any site he chose. Abraham, however, had a specific place in mind, the cave of Machpelah, located at the end of a field belonging to a man named Ephron, son of Zohar. 23:9. Abraham requested Ephron sell him that cave for full price. Ephron, who was sitting among the Hittites in the assembly, initially offered to give Abraham the field and cave outright. 23:10-11. But Abraham insisted on paying, not wanting it as a mere gift, likely to ensure uncontested legal ownership into perpetuity. Ephron then named a price: 400 shekels of silver, between me and you. What is that? 23:15. Some commentators note this might have been a rather steep price for that time, implying Ephron was shrewdly getting a great deal while acting nonchalant. Regardless, Abraham agreed without haggling. He weighed out for Ephron the silver, as agreed in the hearing of the Hittites. 23:16. Thus, legally and publicly, the field of Machpelah with the cave and all trees within it were made over to Abraham as a possession. 23:17-18. Abraham buried Sarah his wife in the cave of Machpelah facing Mamre, that is Hebron. 23:19. The narrator reiterates that this field and cave were deeded to Abraham as a burying place. 23:20, underscoring the significance that now Abraham had a foothold of ownership in the Promised Land. Burying Sarah in Canaan was an act of faith on Abraham's part too. He didn't ship her body back to their old family tombs in Mesopotamia. Instead, he anchored her memory in the land God promised to them. It was like saying, we truly belong here, even in death. This also signalled to Isaac and the community that Abraham was committed to Canaan as his homeland under God's promise, not a transient dwelling. The tomb of Machpelah became the ancestral burial site. Later, Abraham himself, Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob and Leah would be buried there. It thus became a sacred family heritage site, which is still honoured to this day. Presently in Hebron stands the tomb of the patriarchs over that cave. For Abraham, saying goodbye to Sarah must have been a deeply sorrowful experience. They had been married probably over a century, given she was childless until 90, and probably married much younger. Their journey from Ur to Haran to Canaan, their shared trials, she was truly a partner in the covenant. Isaiah 51:2 later would say, "Look to Sarah who bore you to Israel," indicating her exemplary role. In Hebrews 11:11, Sarah is commended for faith to conceive strength even in age, so her legacy in faith is recognised. In Jewish tradition, the story of purchasing Machpelah is significant because it establishes Jewish connection to Hebron. It's also often pointed out that Abraham insisted on paying, showing integrity and a desire to avoid future disputes or the impression of indebtedness. He wanted a clear title deed. Also, historically, 400 shekels of silver is a very high amount. Jeremiah bought a field for 17 shekels much later, though economic contexts differ. So Abraham wasn't looking for a bargain. He valued having a secure family tomb enough to pay top price, indicating how much he honoured Sarah and the importance of this land transaction. After Sarah's burial, Abraham was now a widower. Genesis 24 immediately goes on to Abraham securing a bride for Isaac. He likely took Sarah's absence as impetus to ensure Isaac had a partner to carry on the family. Later, Genesis 25, 1-6 will briefly mention Abraham marrying Keturah and having additional children, but those children would be sent east with gifts, while Isaac remained the heir, 25, 5-6. But in terms of narrative weight, Sarah's death closes one chapter, the year of the first generation covenant couple, and transitions to the next generation story, with Isaac now stepping forward as the carrier of the promise. We don't hear of Abraham's mourning beyond that initial weeping and the effort he put into honouring her with a proper burial, but one can imagine he reminisced on their journey, thanking God for Sarah's life. Sarah had laughed at the idea of bearing a son, and then laughed with joy when Isaac came. Her very name meant princess, and indeed she became the matriarch of the line of promise, honoured by all who trace spiritual lineage to Abraham. Thus, Sarah's sunset years ended in the land of promise, with the laughter of Isaac likely giving her joy to the end, and Abraham's love for her is enshrined in the very ground he bought to lay her to rest. The cave of Machpelah, where Sarah was buried, stands as a monument not only to their family's presence in the land, but to a love and partnership that endured many trials by faith. In summing up, Abraham's acquisition of a burial site illustrates a fusion of the practical and the faithful, dealing with death and grief, but doing so with an eye to God's promises and establishing a legacy in the promised land. It shows Abraham is still a sojourner, calls himself that, yet also now a landowner of a piece of Canaan, signifying a partial fulfillment and a hopeful symbol that one day his descendants will fully possess this land as God pledged. The purchase of the cave of Machpelah to bury Sarah is more than a touching funeral story. It represents Abraham's first concrete ownership of land in Canaan, literally owning a piece of the promised land. In grief, Abraham took a decisive step that had lasting significance for his posterity. Up until Genesis 23, God had promised Abraham and his descendants the land, but Abraham himself had been content living as a nomad, pitching tents and moving about without seeking land titles. Now, the death of Sarah made it imperative to have a permanent burial site. It would have been unacceptable in that culture to bury a family member just anywhere without rights to the land. So Abraham approached the Hittites with humility and respect. "I am a stranger and sojourner among you," 23:4. Despite being wealthy and renowned, they acknowledged him as a mighty prince. Abraham didn't presume rights. He negotiated as an outsider. This humility and fairness likely contributed to their high regard for him. The Hittites' initial offer was generous to the point of hyperbole. "None of us will withhold from you his tomb to prevent you from burying your dead," 23:6. They were willing to give Abraham the best of their own burial places. However, Abraham's resolve to purchase it outright was important for a couple of reasons. First, in the ancient Near East, gifts could come with strings attached or could be contested later. A purchase with witnesses ensured clear ownership. Abraham wanted the burial site to remain in his family line perpetually, not as a loan or favour that might be revoked. Second, symbolically, Abraham owning that land parcel meant the promise of land was beginning to materialize tangibly. Even though it was just a field and a cave, it was something he could call his own in Canaan, a seed of future possession for his descendants. The narrative's detail on the negotiation process, including the amount of 400 shekels of silver, according to the weights current among the merchants, 2316, underscores the legal and formal nature of the transaction. Everyone at the city gate witnessed it. This would deter any later dispute. Indeed, later in Genesis, Jacob will be buried there, Genesis 49:29-32, and nobody challenges their right to the tomb. The meticulous recording of the purchase in Scripture also perhaps served to solidify Israel's ancestral claim to that site, which is still revered today. The mention of the trees in the field in verse 17 suggests that the sale was comprehensive. Everything within the field boundaries was included. That detail is akin to a deed description, and it shows how precise the biblical author is about Abraham's full ownership. By burying Sarah in the heart of Canaan, Hebron is centrally located in the Judean hills, Abraham effectively anchored his family's future in the Promised Land. He could have, theoretically, returned to Mesopotamia or sent Sarah's body to their kin's burial grounds, but he didn't. This was a statement: our place is here, where God brought us. This aligns with Hebrews 11:13-16, which describes how the patriarchs died in faith, not having received the full promise, but having seen it from afar and embraced it, and they desired a homeland that was heavenly, with God not ashamed to be called their God. Abraham owning that grave plot in Canaan could be seen as a small down payment on the heavenly country they ultimately looked for, and a sign they truly considered Canaan home as given by God. From a narrative perspective, Sarah's burial is a pivot. After it, the focus turns to securing Isaac's future. Genesis 24 is about finding Isaac a wife, and then to Abraham's twilight, Genesis 25's mention of his sons by Keturah, his eventual passing. In burying Sarah, Abraham possibly confronted his own mortality. Sarah's death likely impressed on him the urgency to ensure the covenant line's continuity, motivating him to arrange Isaac's marriage promptly in the next chapter. It's notable that Abraham's trust in God's promises remains firm despite losing Sarah. He doesn't waver or question God here, unlike earlier times when he worried about not having an heir. He honours Sarah's memory by investing in a permanent family burial ground, reflecting hope that his offspring will indeed continue in the land to use it. This is indeed what happens. Isaac and Ishmael bury Abraham in that same cave, Genesis 25:9, and later Jacob buries Isaac there, and Joseph will bury Jacob there, Genesis 50:13. Machpelah becomes the collective memorial of the patriarchal family. Theologically, it is often pointed out that the only land Abraham owned was a grave, suggesting that sometimes God's promises might not be fully realized in this lifetime, but by faith one still secures a foothold in hope of the future. That grave was like a token of eventual inheritance of the whole land. It also humanizes Abraham. For all his epic faith adventures, he faces the sorrow of losing loved ones and has to deal with very earthly matters like buying a burial plot. His faith doesn't exempt him from grief, but it shapes how he deals with it, with dignity, hope, and an eye on God's promises. Sarah's death also ended the first generation of the covenant couple, meaning now the torch was passing in effect to Isaac and Rebekah, once Isaac marries. Abraham is entering an elder statesman role, and soon after we will hear of his death as well. Yet the purchase of Machpelah assures that Abraham and Sarah's physical remains rest in the land God swore to them. Again, a testament to their faith that God would one day give that land fully to their seed, which he did centuries later when the Israelites, their descendants, took possession of Canaan under Joshua. Machpelah's cave thus stands as a silent witness through those centuries. When the Israelites came out of Egypt to Canaan, they carried with them Joseph's bones to bury in Shechem, but the bones of Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob and Leah were already at rest in Canaan at Hebron, as if awaiting their return. It's poetic. The patriarchs who sojourned never fully saw the promise, but in death they were in the land, almost like seeds planted awaiting the nation to spring forth around them. In summary, the burial in Canaan was Abraham's way of both honouring Sarah and staking claim to God's promise in a tangible way. It combined practical necessity with symbolic faith action, owning a piece of the promise. It reveals Abraham's integrity in dealing with his neighbours, his reverence for the dead, and his unwavering belief that Canaan was indeed the land of his and his descendants' destiny under God's covenant. The chapter closes with Abraham moving on after laying Sarah to rest, but Machpelah remained a symbol that though Abraham was a foreigner owning only a grave, that grave pointed to the enduring hope that God would indeed give life, descendants, to fill the land of Canaan, even out of death and sorrow. And indeed, through Isaac, and later Jacob and the tribes, that hope came to fruition. Following Sarah's death and burial, Abraham's attention turned to the future of the covenant line, specifically finding a suitable wife for Isaac. Isaac was about 40 at this time, Genesis. Ensuring Isaac married well was crucial, as the descendants of Abraham would come through this union. Abraham was living in Canaan among the Canaanites, but those people had different customs and gods that Abraham did not want grafted into his family line. Thus, Abraham took initiative. He summoned his senior servant, the steward of his house, traditionally identified as Eliezer of Damascus from Genesis 15:2, though he's not named in Genesis 24, and made him swear a solemn oath. Abraham had the servant place his hand under Abraham's thigh, a cultural oath ritual likely symbolizing allegiance related to progeny, and he charged him, "You shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell, but will go to my country and to my kindred, and take a wife for my son Isaac." Genesis 24:3-4. This was a big ask, essentially to travel perhaps 500 plus miles back to Mesopotamia, Aram Naharaim, specifically the region of Haran where Abraham's brother's family remained, to find a wife from Abraham's extended family. Abraham, though settled in Canaan, still saw his kin as those who worshipped the same God, or at least were aware of him, and had proper morals, unlike the Canaanites whose iniquity was great. The servant was concerned. "Perhaps the woman will not be willing to follow me to this land. Must I then take your son back to the land you came from?" 24.5. He's essentially asking, if the bride won't move here, should Isaac move there? Abraham was emphatic. "See to it that you do not take my son back there." 24:6. Under no circumstances was Isaac to leave Canaan permanently. Abraham explains that God had brought him here and promised this land to his seed, and that he will send his angel before you, and you shall take a wife for my son from there. Genesis 24:7. Abraham expresses confident faith that God will guide this mission. But he also gives the servant an out. "If the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be free from this oath." 24:8. This shows Abraham's understanding that they must not force someone, it must be providential. The servant then swears to the oath. 24:9. So the servant departs with 10 camels and a variety of gifts. 24:10. He travels to Mesopotamia, to the city of Nahor, named after Abraham's brother. When he arrives near evening at a well outside the city, he makes his camels kneel by the water. Recognizing he needs God's help to identify the right woman, the servant prays a specific prayer. "O Lord, God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today and show steadfast love to my master. Let the young woman to whom I say, 'Please let down your jar that I may drink,' and who answers, 'Drink, and I will also water your camels,' let her be the one you have appointed for your servant Isaac." Genesis 24:12-14. This is a clever and faith-filled test. Offering water to a stranger was customary courtesy, but volunteering to water 10 thirsty camels was above and beyond. Camels can drink a lot. It would indicate extraordinary kindness, diligence, and hospitality. The servant essentially is asking God for a sign that combines providence with revealing the woman's character. Remarkably, before he finished praying, Rebekah came out with her water jar, 24:15. She's introduced as the daughter of Bethuel, son of Milcah and Nahor, Abraham's brother. So she's a grandniece of Abraham and a cousin once removed of Isaac. The narrator notes she's very attractive and a virgin, 24:16. She fills her jar. The servant runs to ask her for a little water from her jar, 24:17. She says, "Drink, my lord," and quickly lets him drink. When he's done, she adds, "I will draw water for your camels also, until they have finished drinking," 24:18-19. This is exactly what the servant prayed for. She hurriedly empties her jar into the trough and runs back to draw water for all the camels, 24:20. The servant, silently watching, is astonished at her industriousness and the answered prayer, wondering if she is indeed the one God prepared, 24:21. After the camels are done, he gives her a gold nose ring and 2 heavy gold bracelets, 24:22. Then he asks whose daughter she is and if there's room at her father's house for lodging. She identifies her lineage. I am the daughter of Bethuel, son of Milcah, whom she bore to Nahor. 24:24. This must have flooded the servant with joy. She's from Abraham's own family. She also says there's plenty of straw and fodder and room to spend the night at her home. 24:25. At this, the servant bows and worships the Lord, blessing God for his faithfulness to Abraham and guiding him to Abraham's kin. 24:26-27. Rebekah, seeing this man worship, likely realizes something significant is afoot. She runs home and tells her mother's household about these events. 24:28. Her brother Laban, who will be significant later in Jacob's story, sees the jewellery and hears her account, and he runs out to invite the servant, saying, "Come in, O blessed of the Lord." 24:31. Laban's hospitality is likely motivated partly by seeing the expensive gifts. They provide straw for camels and water to wash feet. 24:32. Food is set, but the servant refuses to eat until he shares his mission. 24:33. He then recounts the whole story in detail to Bethuel, Rebekah's father, and Laban. He describes Abraham's wealth, Isaac's unique inheritance, the oath to find Isaac a wife from their family, his prayer at the well, and Rebekah's fulfilling that sign exactly. He asks if they will show steadfast love and faithfulness to Abraham by allowing Rebekah to become Isaac's wife. 24:49. Laban and Bethuel answer, "The thing has come from the Lord. We cannot speak bad or good. Behold, Rebekah is before you. Take her and go, and let her be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has spoken." 24:51. They recognize God's hand and consent. Hearing this, the servant bows again to worship God. 24:52. He then brings out more jewellery, clothing for Rebekah, and costly gifts for her family. 24:53. They eat and drink and spend the night. 24:54. By morning, the servant is eager to depart with Rebekah, but her family hesitates, asking, "Let the girl remain with us a few days, at least 10. After that she may go." Genesis 24:55. Perhaps they want a proper farewell or to ensure she's ready. But the servant is urgent, saying, "Don't delay since God gave success." 24:56. They then decide to ask Rebekah herself. She responds, "I will go." 24:58. This shows Rebekah's own faith and willingness. She agrees to leave her home and journey to a far land to marry a cousin she's never met, trusting in this unfolding providence. They bless Rebekah with a farewell. "Our sister, may you become thousands of 10,000s, and may your offspring possess the gates of those who hate them." 24:60. This parallels the Abrahamic blessing. Indeed, Genesis 22:17 said the same about offspring possessing gates of enemies. Rebekah and her maids then depart, riding on camels with the servant. 24:61. As they approach the Negev, Isaac is out in the field meditating toward evening. 24:63. He sees the camels coming. Rebekah sees a man and dismounts, asking the servant who it is. He says, "It is my master." 24:65. She then modestly veils herself, as was custom for meeting one's husband or to show modesty. The servant gives Isaac a full report of all he'd done. 24:66. Isaac then brought Rebekah into his mother Sarah's tent, symbolically making her the new matriarch, and she became his wife. 24:67. It says, "He loved her, and Isaac was comforted after his mother's death." This is touching. Rebekah's arrival helped Isaac emotionally. Sarah's tent had been empty after Sarah died, but now Rebekah fills that space as Isaac's wife. It seems Isaac had been mourning Sarah significantly, but Rebekah's love helped alleviate that grief. This story stands out for its emphasis on God's providence and human faithfulness in partnership. The servant's loyalty, prayerfulness, and worshipfulness is exemplary. Rebekah's kindness, decisiveness, and bravery shine. Abraham's faith and principles guide the process, and Isaac, though passive in the chapter, is the beneficiary of all this. The long retelling by the servant of his journey underscores how evidently God orchestrated it. It shows how the continuity of the covenant line was carefully preserved both by divine action and human responsibility. Not marrying Canaanites prevented the covenant family from being assimilated into the idolatrous cultures around them. It's also a romantic narrative in a way. one of the first accounts of how a bride is found for a groom in Scripture, complete with suspense, divine signs, family negotiations, and finally love. Isaac and Rebekah's marriage, like Abraham and Sarah's, is born out of faith and promise rather than simple human arrangement. Through this, Abraham ensured that Isaac had a wife from among their own people, who presumably knew or could come to know the Lord, since Laban and family acknowledged Yahweh's name. Rebekah's willingness to journey mirrored Abraham's own call years ago to leave his homeland at God's leading. In a sense, Rebekah became an heir of Sarah's legacy of faith, leaving her home to join the covenant family in Canaan. Their first meeting, Isaac meditating, Rebekah veiling, carries a gentle poignancy and reverence. Isaac taking Rebekah into Sarah's tent suggests she assumed Sarah's place as the female head of the household, and Isaac loving her indicates a deep bond was formed. With Isaac married, the covenant could continue, and indeed twin sons would be born to them, Esau and Jacob, continuing the story. Abraham could see the next generation established before he died, which likely gave him peace. In summary, securing a bride for Isaac was an essential step in ensuring the covenant's future, and it was accomplished with heavy reliance on God's guidance. The faithful servant, the hospitable Rebekah, and the sovereign God behind the scenes all converged to bring about Isaac's marriage. It's a beautiful demonstration that God's promises often come to pass through ordinary events, fetching water, family negotiations, travel, that become extraordinary when guided by prayer and providence. Abraham's trust in God to provide the right wife, echoed by the servant and even Rebekah's family, shows the continuing thread of faith in this clan. For Isaac, receiving Rebekah not only brought him love, but also symbolized that the baton of the promise had truly passed to him. He now had his partner to walk in Abraham and Sarah's footsteps as part of God's unfolding plan to birth a great nation. A standout aspect of the story of finding Isaac's wife is the moment at the well where Rebekah's kindness becomes the very sign of God's answer to prayer. The servant's prayer was strikingly specific. He asked that the chosen young woman would not only give him a drink when asked, but volunteer to water his 10 camels as well. This was a deliberately high bar for hospitality. Watering camels was arduous. A single thirsty camel can drink over 20 gallons. 10 camels might need 200 plus gallons. Drawing that much water with a jar from a well was no small task. It could take an hour or more of hard labour. By proposing this sign, the servant was essentially saying, let the woman who is truly right for Isaac be one of extraordinary generosity and work ethic, someone who goes above and beyond in kindness to a stranger. This would mirror the character of Abraham himself, who ran to prepare a feast for guests in Genesis 18, and of Sarah's hospitality, and would bode well for her role as matriarch in a family called to represent God's values. Amazingly, Rebekah fulfills this criteria to the letter without knowing anything about the servant's mission. When he asks for a sip, she promptly gives it, and then proactively says, I will draw water for your camels also, until they have finished drinking, Genesis. Note she says, until they have finished, implying she's prepared to keep at it until all camels are satisfied, not just a token bucket or two. She quickly emptied her jar into the trough and ran again to draw multiple times, 24:20. The text emphasizes her eagerness and diligence. Words like quickly and ran paint the picture of energetic service. The servant holding his peace watched to learn whether the Lord had prospered his journey or not, 24:21. One can imagine his growing excitement and perhaps awe as he sees Rebekah doing exactly what he prayed someone would do. Rebekah's kindness wasn't just a random act, it revealed her character. She was obviously strong to draw all that water, hard-working and unafraid of labour. She was generous to a stranger, indicating compassion and hospitality ingrained in her upbringing, which perhaps says something positive about Bethuel's household too. Also, considering she was likely of marriageable age, somewhere mid-teens to early 20s perhaps, her willingness to do such manual work, typically the role of a household servant, suggests humility. She wasn't too proud to get her hands wet and dirty. This kindness becomes the linchpin that triggers everything else. The servant gifts her jewellery, asks about her family, realizes she's kin to Abraham, and then praises God for not forsaking his steadfast love and faithfulness, 24:27. He explicitly notes God led me straight to the house of my master's kinsman. but it was through Rebekah's actions that he identified the path. It's a beautiful providence. The servant prayed privately in his heart. 24:45 notes he hadn't yet spoken out loud the prayer when she came. And Rebekah, not hearing any of that, simply following her good nature, answered that prayer. The story likely circulated as a moral example. Notice how Abraham's servant retells the story to Laban and Bethuel, including Rebekah's generosity as the clear indicator of God's choice. 24:45-47. By hearing it, her family also recognizes that her behavior was key and that this matter comes from the Lord. 24:50. They couldn't deny such a direct answer to prayer. Her family's blessing on her as she departs references thousands of 10,000s of offspring and possessing the gates of foes, which parallels the covenant promises to Abraham. It's as if they unwittingly bless her with the very destiny she will have as Isaac's wife in the covenant line. In a way, Rebekah's kindness at the well led to her gaining a new family, a new land, and becoming part of God's salvation history. She will be mother to Jacob, ancestor of the 12 tribes and eventually of the Messiah. The well motif is notable. In the Bible, wells are often places of divine encounters or important meetings. Jacob will meet Rachel at a well, Moses will meet Zipporah at a well. Jesus speaks to the Samaritan woman at a well. Here a well is the scene of answered prayer and providential connection. It reminds readers that sometimes mundane daily tasks, like drawing water, can be the very moments God orchestrates pivotal events. One lesson gleaned is how everyday kindness can set the stage for destiny. Rebekah didn't do a miracle. She just kindly and vigorously served someone's needs, and that became the channel of God's purpose. For Isaac, the kindness of Rebekah likely endeared her to him even before meeting. Imagine hearing from the servant how she volunteered to water all his camels. In marrying her, Isaac gained a wife who mirrored the generous hospitality of his own father and mother. This boded well for their household, and indeed we later see Rebekah's active care, though also her decisive nature in the Jacob-Esau saga. Her strength has two edges. From a narrative standpoint, Rebekah's actions move the plot from uncertainty to certainty. Without them, the servant's quest might have been long or fruitless. The rapid success emphasizes God's providence when a plan aligns with his will. Abraham had confidently said an angel would guide the servant 24/7, and indeed things fall in place with almost miraculous quickness. The generosity of Rebekah is illuminated as both a sign and a means of God's working. In summary, Rebekah's kindness at the well was the critical answer to prayer that guided Abraham's servant directly to the right bride for Isaac. It showcases how virtuous conduct, rooted in hospitality and diligence, can be a conduit for God's blessings and serve as a clear indicator of someone being chosen by God for a special role. It's an inspiring testament to the power of simple goodness and the way God's providence often unfolds through the everyday virtues of people. Isaac's marriage thus begins on the foundation of an answered prayer and a demonstration of character, which is a solid starting point for the covenant family's next generation. In his advanced age, after Isaac's marriage, Abraham's narrative winds down with a few closing details about his later years. Genesis 25:1 states that Abraham took another wife, named Keturah. This likely occurred sometime after Sarah's death, since no mention of Keturah is made while Sarah was alive. It's not clear if Keturah was taken as a wife or a concubine. 1 Chronicles 1:32 calls her Abraham's concubine. Regardless, through Keturah, Abraham had 6 more sons: Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua, 25:2. By this time, Abraham was well over 140, since he was 100 when Isaac was born, and Isaac was 40 when he married Rebekah, making Abraham 140 at that point. The fact that he fathered more children at such an old age is notable. It suggests that the rejuvenation of his powers that allowed Isaac's conception perhaps continued, or that God's blessing on his seed-bearing didn't stop with Isaac. These additional sons are not part of the covenant line, but they do become progenitors of other peoples. For example, one of Keturah's sons, Midian, became the ancestor of the Midianites, a significant group in later biblical history. Moses would marry a Midianite's daughter, etc. The text lists some grandsons through Jokshan, Sheba and Dedan, and names tribes associated with Dedan, and through Midian, Ephah, Ephah, etc. 25:3-4. These names likely link to various Arabian tribes. This shows that Abraham indeed became father of many nations, not just through Ishmael and Isaac, but through these Keturah line descendants too. However, the theological narrative stays focused on Isaac. To ensure no contention for Isaac's inheritance or the covenant blessing, Genesis 25:5-6 notes that Abraham gave all he had to Isaac, but to the sons of his concubines, which would include Hagar and Keturah, Abraham gave gifts and sent them away eastward, while he was still alive, away from Isaac. This indicates Abraham's intention to prevent any family strife, like what happened between Isaac and Ishmael. It also underscores that Isaac is the sole heir of the covenant promises and the bulk of Abraham's wealth, similar to how Ishmael was sent away earlier. Abraham loved his other children enough to give them parting gifts, possibly flocks or valuables to help establish them independently, but then he created distance so that Isaac could develop without them overshadowing or challenging him. Abraham lived to 175 years, 25.7. Then Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people, 25:8. This phrasing, good old age, full of years, gathered to his people, implies a satisfied, fulfilled life. It echoes God's promise back in Genesis 15:15 that Abraham would go to his fathers in peace at a good old age. Indeed, he experienced that. Being gathered to his people is a poetic way to say he joined his ancestors in death, which in Abraham's case would imply an afterlife reunion, since he had left his literal ancestors' land. It hints at an expectation of joining those who died before him. Abraham's death brings Isaac and Ishmael briefly together. His sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah, beside Sarah, 25:9-10. This is touching. Ishmael, who'd been sent away 75 years earlier, apparently returned to pay respects to his father alongside Isaac. They bury Abraham in the very plot Abraham purchased for Sarah, closing the generational loop. After that, the narrative says, God blessed Isaac his son, and Isaac dwelt at Beer Lahairoi, 25:11. Beer Lahairoi is the well associated with Hagar's encounter with God, Genesis, Padinara Padnanga. Perhaps Isaac moved there for a time, maybe it had abundant water, or maybe it indicates he had some continued connection or care for Hagar in Ishmael's memory. Regardless, it signals the shift. With Abraham gone, the mantle fully passes to Isaac, now the patriarch who carries the blessing. As for Abraham's twilight marriage to Keturah, Jewish and Islamic traditions have various takes. Some Jewish midrash even equated Keturah with Hagar, saying Abraham remarried Hagar under a different name, but Genesis treats them separately. Hagar's son Ishmael and Keturah's sons are listed distinctly. Some see Keturah's children as fulfilling part of God's word that Abraham would be father of many nations beyond just Isaac and Ishmael. Also, Keturah's sons establishing eastern tribes fits with later references to people of the east. Job was from Uz, possibly related to this line, etc. The Bible doesn't detail Abraham's relationship with these sons, but clearly he cared enough to provide for them and strategically place them. Abraham's final days appear to have been spent seeing Isaac happily married, and likely seeing the birth of Esau and Jacob, since Isaac was 60 when the twins were born, making Abraham 160 at their birth. He'd have 15 years of life with them. Indeed, Jacob later recounts memories of Abraham, presumably. Perhaps Abraham got to bounce his grandsons on his knee, telling them stories of God's wonders, one can imagine. Surely he would have imparted to Isaac and Rebekah all he could about walking with God, and instructed Jacob and Esau in their early years about the promises. However, by the time Jacob and Esau grow older, Abraham had passed. In summary, Abraham's final years were relatively peaceful and blessed. He had additional children, secured Isaac's future, and died content, having seen the fulfillment of God's key promise, an heir, Isaac, and a glimmer of the numerous descendants, seeing grandsons and other children. His life closed with honour. He was buried in the promised land by both of his older sons, indicating respect from both family branches. The text moves on to Isaac's story then with confidence that the covenant continues. Abraham is one of the few in Scripture given an epitaph like full of years, which implies satisfaction. He had his share of trials, but by the end he experienced God's faithfulness at every stage, calling him out, giving him a son, and even caring for his other children. His legacy was firmly established. The coda, God blessed Isaac his son right after Abraham's burial, indicates that the direct blessing Abraham walked in now rests fully on Isaac. as if God's presence and favour seamlessly transferred to carry on the covenant line. Abraham's chapter of the story was complete, but its effects would ripple through all generations to follow, fulfilling the promise that in you all families of the earth shall be blessed. Abraham's later life decisions, like ensuring Isaac's marriage and proper inheritance, facilitated the continuation of God's plan without hiccup in transition. As such, Abraham's twilight can be seen as wisely managing the covenant succession and tying up loose ends, as evidenced by sending away other sons to prevent disputes. Thus, with Abraham's death, a monumental era ended. The friend of God, Isaiah 41.8, and father of faith, left a heritage of faith, obedience, and tangible footholds in Canaan. The narrative baton now passed fully to Isaac and soon to Jacob, but Abraham's example would loom large over them. Indeed, God often identifies himself to Isaac and Jacob as the God of your father Abraham. Abraham's final act of being buried next to Sarah in Machpelah meant he ended where she did, in hope in the land promised, awaiting the fuller fulfillment of all God had sworn. His story closed, but as Jesus noted centuries later, God is not the God of the dead, but of the living, indicating that Abraham still lives unto God. Mark 12:26-27. A truth that fits with gathered to his people in a faithful expectation of resurrection and promise beyond the grave. Abraham's final days thus encapsulate a finish line crossed well, his faith proven, promises passed on, and a life's mission accomplished under God's guiding hand. Abraham's life story, from his humble start in Ur to his burial in Canaan's soil, cements him as the father of many nations, in more than one sense. Biologically, through Isaac and Ishmael and the sons of Keturah, Abraham indeed became the ancestor of a multitude of peoples. The Israelites descended from Isaac and Jacob, the Ishmaelites and many Arab tribes, from Ishmael, the Midianites and others from Keturah's children. Genesis 25 lists 12 princes from Ishmael, echoing the 12 tribes from Jacob, a sign of God's blessing on both branches of Abraham's offspring. Even beyond the Bible, Abraham is traditionally claimed as forefather by numerous Arab clans. Thus, literally Abraham's seed spread widely, fulfilling God's word that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars of heaven and grains of sand. Yet, Abraham's title, Father of Many Nations, in Hebrew Avraham itself, embodies father of a multitude, transcends mere biology. In the spiritual realm, Abraham fathered the faith of multitudes. 3 major world religions, Judaism, Christianity and Islam, revere him as a foundational figure. To the Jews, he is the first patriarch, the recipient of God's covenant, the model of obedience. They point to the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, as Abraham's ultimate act of devotion. To Christians, Abraham is the prototype of justification by faith. The Apostle Paul calls him the father of all who believe, Romans 4:11, and notes that those who have faith are children of Abraham. Abraham's trust in God's promises, even when unseen, is held up as the benchmark of saving faith, Galatians 3:6-9. Thus millions upon millions of Christians around the world, though not physical descendants, see themselves as Abraham's spiritual offspring. He is our father in faith, as Paul and the author of Hebrews stress. In Islam, Ibrahim, is honoured as one of the greatest prophets and a patriarch. Arabs trace lineage through Ishmael. The Quran speaks of Ibrahim as a model of pure worship, the one who established the Kaaba with Ishmael in Mecca. Muslims worldwide call Abraham Khalilullah, friend of God, a title drawn from Islamic tradition akin to the Bible's reference. During the annual Hajj pilgrimage, events from Abraham's life, like the near sacrifice of his son, which Islamic tradition says was Ishmael, not Isaac, are ritually commemorated. So Abraham's faith heritage literally unites half the world's population in some way. Over 4 billion people from these faiths consider him a key figure. In Genesis 17:4-5, when God renamed him Abraham, he said, "I have made you the father of a multitude of nations." And this has come true in both flesh and faith. We see that Abraham's impact is not confined to Israel, but extends globally. He's a unifying figure across cultures. This is the fulfillment of God's promise that in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed, Genesis. 12:3 Christians interpret that as culminating in Jesus Christ, a descendant of Abraham, bringing salvation to all nations, thus Abraham's lineage blessing the world. Jews see Abraham's blessing as flowing through the ethical monotheism he pioneered. which has influenced so much of civilization. Muslims see the blessing in the pure monotheistic worship and submission, exemplified by Ibrahim, passed down through Ishmael to the Arab nation and Islam. Indeed, the concept of Abrahamic religions underscores that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam find common root in Abraham's revelation of one God and covenant. Abraham's legacy in thought and culture is enormous. His life of wandering in hope became a motif. He's the archetype of the pilgrim looking for a promised homeland. For the author of Hebrews, Abraham exemplified living as a stranger on earth seeking a heavenly city, Hebrews 11:9-10, 13-16. For countless believers, Abraham's trusting obedience, like leaving everything at God's call or offering Isaac, challenges and inspires them to have faith against all odds. Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness, became a cornerstone doctrine of faith-based righteousness. Abraham is also seen as a model of hospitality, as in the story of entertaining the three angels, of intercessory prayer, pleading for Sodom, of courage, rescuing Lot from kings, and of covenantal devotion, circumcising his household, instructing his children. In ethics and philosophy, he's often brought up in discussions, e.g., the binding of Isaac raises profound questions about obedience to God versus moral intuition, which philosophers like Kierkegaard famously explored in Fear and Trembling, calling Abraham a knight of faith, transcending ethics by virtue of the absurd trust in God. Thus, Abraham's story continues to be analysed for its theological, moral, and existential implications. On a tangible note, Abraham's tomb in Hebron, the cave of Machpelah, is one of the world's oldest continuously venerated sites, held sacred by Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike, a testament to how his physical heritage still stands in stone and tradition. Though Abraham died thousands of years ago, his many nations legacy is very much alive. Nearly every nation has people of the Abrahamic faiths. Truly, the promises have been fulfilled beyond what Abraham likely imagined. Not only did kings come from him, Israelite kings, and via Jesus, the King of Kings, but global spiritual kingship in a sense, as Revelation speaks of Christians as a kingdom of priests. The imagery of his descendants being as innumerable as stars or sand is apt. Who can count those who call Abraham father in one sense or another? In summing up Abraham's journey, leaving Mesopotamia at God's call, traversing Canaan, experiencing covenant, trials, triumphs, we see the blueprint of God's salvation history. Abraham's faith and fallibility both encourage us. He wasn't perfect, he lied about Sarah, struggled with waiting, took Hagar, yet God's grace upheld him and used him. This is why Paul calls Abraham the father of us all, because like us he was justified by faith and not by works, and like us he sometimes stumbled yet never finally fell away from trusting God. His life is a beacon showing that relationship with God is built on trust, promises, and grace. In Abraham's legacy, we also see the idea of Abraham's bosom in later Jewish thought, a depiction of paradise, where the righteous dead rest with Abraham, Luke 16:22. That image signifies how closely identity with Abraham was linked to being in God's favour for ancient Jews. To be with Abraham was to be home. Thus, Abraham's story closes not with an end, but an open beginning. The Father has laid the foundation for the family of God among humanity. From Isaac to Jacob, to the tribes of Israel, to ultimately the birth of Jesus, Abraham's lineage carried forward the revelation of the one God and prepared the way for redemption for all nations. The New Testament opens calling Jesus the son of Abraham, Matthew. One-to-one, tying the Messiah directly into Abraham's line and promises. Through Christ, Paul notes, the blessing of Abraham, justification by faith in the Spirit, has come to the Gentiles, Galatians 3:14. So Abraham's many nations find unity and blessing in the one promised seed, Christ, Galatians 3:16. In that ultimate sense, Abraham truly is a father of a multitude beyond count, comprising a great cloud of witnesses and believers from every tribe, tongue, and people. As we reflect on Abraham's life, it's clear his journey of faith, with all its detours and tests, became the prototype of how God relates to people, calling them out, making covenant, developing trust, providing, testing, and ultimately blessing beyond measure. Abraham's willingness to follow God not knowing the destination shaped the spiritual landscape of the world. His title, Father of Many Nations, is not just ancestral, it's honorific, earned by pioneering a pathway of faith that many nations would eventually walk. In Abraham, we see a man who was promised, I will make your name great, Genesis 12.2. And indeed, there are few names greater or more universally revered. His life invites all of us to consider the call to trust in something bigger than ourselves and to join the great family of faith of which he is patriarch. In that sense, the journey of Abraham, though completed in his person, continues in the lives of all who, like him, step out in faith looking for a promised home under God's guidance. Just as Abraham's story has inspired generations, if you found this deep dive into his life enriching, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more explorations into history, faith, and culture. What part of Abraham's journey resonated most with you? Comment below with your thoughts or any questions. We'd love to hear your perspective, and if you know someone who'd enjoy this story of adventure and faith, share this video with them. Remember, the journey of learning is ongoing, so join us next time as we delve into another remarkable story that shaped our world. Thank you for watching, and stay curious.